What happens when one man tries to watch all of the sci-fi films of the 1980s? Well, we're about to find out because I'm your host, Josh Spiegel, and this is the 80s Project, 1983 sci-fi. We've already begun 1983 for horror films, but that's not all that this year had to offer. Yes, in this special side series, we're covering all of the sci-fi of that year as well. But I should specify that it's not just sci-fi, as this series will also include fantasy, sword and sorcery, superhero stuff, and even kaiju films. And believe it or not, but all of those are included right here in this first episode. So we're going to get a nice cross section of what this year has to offer. We start off the year in Italy, and appropriately enough, begin on January 1st as we're beginning with Warrior of the Lost World. A text crawl tells us that radiation wars and such have collapsed society, and a bad dude named Prosser basically took over everything with a force called the Omega, and a rebellion called the Outsiders fought back, and there's also a forbidden zone called the Wasteland, and then also the Warriors with a group of elders. And oh my god, just get to the movie! Why did you do this? Just write a book! Also, the Outsiders are led by McWayne and Natasha, and one man is going to make the difference, and he's the Warrior of the Lost World. And he rides this silver motorcycle named Einstein. He's chased by Mad Max, or whatever, an Omega agent, and he blows everyone up. And the rider is Robert Ginty from the Exterminator, and he's attacked several times, getting injured pretty bad. Luckily, he's saved by the Mystics in the mountain, and the godfather of Harlem, Black Caesar, is here, and they heal him up. Star Trek's Ilya is here with hair, and she convinces him to help them by pulling a gun and putting it up to his junk. He agrees, and they encounter mutants and then infiltrate Prosser's city, which is full of people in gray jumpsuits who are killed for any sort of original thought or emotion. And they rescue Natasha's dad, but she gets captured instead. When we finally meet Prosser, he's no other than Loomis, although he's looking like his version of Blofeld here, and the rider has to team up with the scattered marginals to get her back and bring him down. And this is yet another one that cropped up in the big wave of post-apocalyptic films in the wake of the success of The Road Warrior. It was both written and directed by David Worth, and was one of his earlier works that was not of an X-rated variety. After this, though, he'd jump heavily into the action world and even made the Van Damme film Kickboxer and Shark Attack 3 Megalodon. It's said that Fred Williamson was in Italy already, likely filming another Mad Max clone, Warriors of the Wasteland, and was enjoying it there, and he wanted to stay. So he heard about the production and tracked down Worth and asked him for a spot in the movie so that he can get his visa extended and stay there longer. The movie did fine when it was released, but gained a new life when it became one of the more popular episodes of Mystery Science Theater 3000, and the recurring joke about how annoying his talking motorcycle is. And this is pretty standard stuff. I'll give it a 2. Some of the action bits are fun, but there's just not enough, and it's a total slog between. Its significance is also a 2, since it has an okay cast list and has become somewhat known, although mainly for the MST3K crowd. Should you watch it? Yeah, you could leave this in the Lost World.
It's starting to get on my nerves, you know that?
Here's one I've covered elsewhere on this channel a couple of times, and it arrived on January 21st, and it's The Treasure of the Four Crowns. The opening crawl tells us of the Four Crowns, which can give people great power, and that one man will find a key to open their gifts. And okay, get ready for this. We meet Treasure Hunter, JT Stryker, and he's played by Tony Anthony. And we'll talk more about him later, but he's wearing a really sharp jacket and enters into this remote castle, and oops, he's attacked by a mongoose with a sword in his mouth, and then a vulture, and I guess a baby pterodactyl, And an owl? Where the hell did he walk into? And why is everything coming right at the camera? Well, I think you know the answer to that one. This film was originally in 3D when it was released. And oh man, does it take advantage of that. Next up, there's a snake that comes at him, allowing Anthony to really show off that acting range. And then a dog. And is this like a weird zoo that was abandoned? He finally finds this tomb with a skeleton that points right at him, of course, and a sword that points right at him, of course, before he finds a key. A key that you will grow to hate by the time that this movie is over. But then, immediately, crossbows? Right at him. Spears? Right at him. Fireballs? You guessed it, right at him. And then, remember in Raiders of the Lost Ark when Indiana Jones was chased by a boulder? Well, this movie's like, what if there were more of them? And what if they were on fire? And he finally escapes when the castle explodes. Now, here's the important part. There has been no dialogue up until this point. And this is 20 minutes into the movie. 20 minutes! It's just an opening action sequence, and it's about a quarter of the runtime. It's amazing. We then get a history of the Four Crowns with as many things poked at the camera as possible, and we're told that 3 of the crowns vanished, and one is in the care of this guy here, and he also says that another one was discovered ages ago, and someone tried to open it without the key, and it was destroyed. They open the one with the key and find a piece of scroll, but the other remaining 2 are in the care of a madman named Jonas, who is a sort of a cult leader and a veritable fortress. And JT agrees to put together a team to go in and steal them. And that's when it happens. The key starts to whistle and squeal and fly around the room, causing havoc, sometimes clearly on a string. And this goes on for several minutes, making that high-pitched whine the entire freaking time. And if it didn't drive you crazy there, well, in about 15 minutes, it does it all again. And yeah, I can't begin to really describe how weird this movie is, but our lead, Tony Anthony, is actually the producer. And if his middle name is also Anthony, does that make him Tony? But Anthony had previously produced a 3D film called Comin' At Ya, an action film that is credited with kickstarting the 3D boom of the 80s and made a fair amount of money, so he was anxious to repeat that success. Since Raiders was a huge sensation, clearly this capitalizes on that, and even though it was meant as a follow-up to Comin' At Ya, it is not a sequel, more like a spiritual successor. It ended up being a bit of a bomb and only made around $5 million, less than half of that of the previous film. Because of that, Anthony stopped acting and stuck with producing, and the ending of the film, which sets up a sequel, well, doesn't really make sense anyway. The reviews were pretty rough, and nearly everyone dismissed it as a Raiders clone, but it got near non-stop cable runs, and one thing that didn't get any scorn is that amazing score from Ennio Morricone. And look, I'm giving this a 4, but it's not good. It does not deserve a 4, but I love this movie, and I have since I saw it on HBO and wanted to be JT for Halloween. It's just so weird and fun and stupid, and I can watch it at any time. I guarantee that you will not also give this a 4, but I am. Its SFCS is just a 2 though, since it's mostly just known as a ripoff and a big-time 3D abuser and a constant cable staple. Should you watch it? I think so. Just be prepared to be annoyed by that key. Just a few days later, in France, our next entry arrived on January 26th, and it was called The Prize of Peril. It opens with a man on the run, or I guess you could just call him a running man, as people applaud him and helicopters film, with the guy shooting at him and smacking him with chains until he's dead. It's all a part of a TV show where a contestant is chased down by 5 killers, and if they survive, they get a big cash prize, and if they die, their family gets a much smaller reward. Of course, the show is protested as cruel and sadistic, and they're concerned about their ringleader. All the same, they're still holding auditions for the next round, and they think that they found their man with Francois. His girlfriend is opposed to it because no one has ever survived the show, but before you get on the main show, you have to survive the first round. 3 contestants are set up in little planes, and when they're up there, the pilots parachute out, leaving the guys to land the planes on their own with no previous ability on how to fly. One guy chickens out while another crashes, leaving Francois alone in the sky, and against all odds, he manages to land. Ms. Worms is unable to get the show shut down, so the big day arrives and we meet the men that will be hunting down Francois, and one of them belongs in a delicatessen. After the introduction, Francois goes on the run while being hunted down, and you may be saying, hey, all this sounds really familiar. Well, the film The Running Man didn't come out for another 4 years, although the novel it was based on was released in 1982. But this film is actually based on a story called The Prize of Peril by Robert Sheckley and was published in 1958, predating the Stephen King or Richard Bachman or whatever book by over 20 years. This one was by a French director named Yves Boisset, and he also noted the similarities and sued 20th Century Fox over it. He actually won, mostly due to the fact that the Running Man script would actually quote the English translation of Prize of Peril verbatim. However, Fox fought it and appealed, keeping everything tied up in court for over 10 years. And in 1997, it all finally ended with Boisset basically only winning enough money to cover their legal costs. And what a nice surprise, this is a 4 as well. And this one actually does deserve a 4. Sure, it's a bit on the nose with its commentary, but it literally is Running Man before Running Man. And it's shocking how much it seems to have taken from it, especially considering that the changes made from the original King novel seem to be to make it more like this movie. Its significance is going to be a 2 since it's not really known at all, but it's clearly had an influence and was a nice precursor to the reality TV style shows that were coming. Should you watch it? Yes, the prize is actually not peril and instead pleasure. This next one premiered in Texas on January 28th in the US and a little later worldwide. And it's an Australian film called The Return of Captain Invincible. It has Ross, or is he Glenn? Or is he Glengarry? I don't know. Anyway, but film footage from the 30s and the 40s detail out the history of the good captain, a superhero, as he helps out in the war. But as it goes into the 50s, he's McCarthy'd into retirement and disappears from the public eye. Decades later, he resurfaces, as does the villainous Lord Summerisle, and he's overseeing a massive criminal operation while wearing swim goggles on his forehead with Yoda right behind him. He's stolen a government experiment called the Hypno Ray, and the president needs to stop him, and he needs someone like Captain Invincible. And he expresses that in a song?
What the world needs now is a shining hero.
Because, oh yeah, this is a musical. Sort of. They locate Cap and send an operative named Patty to convince him to come out of hiding and help, but he's bottomed out. But not so low that he can't sing a song.
The good guys and the bad guys. Well, it ain't like old Wyatt and Doc.
Unfortunately, he doesn't quite remember how to use his powers, which are magnetic in nature, and discovers that he got his powers because aliens were watching his parents have sex and hit them with a ray beam that gave him abilities from birth. But now he has to try to master his powers again while falling in love with Patty, while also not knowing who to trust thanks to spies within. And this is weird, very weird, and it's from Philippe Mora. And we've already encountered him over on the horror version of the product with The Beast Within back in 1982, but we'll see him again with some Howling sequels and the alien flick Communion. He had originally wanted James Coburn for the role, and Coburn was up for it as the two were good friends. However, they had a big disagreement about the vacuum cleaner scene in which a bunch of Vacs come to life and attack Invincible and Patty, and they had an argument about it being included. And Coburn left the project and decided to find something else for them to do together. The script originally wasn't a musical and was a more straightforward superhero film, but Mora liked musicals and comedy and wanted to incorporate that stuff, so he did a rewrite. Having Lee sing and dance at the time seemed like a novelty, even though he had done The Wicker Man, but he'd later go on to be involved with heavy metal bands and do several concept albums because that guy's voice is killer.
Long before the crack of doom, there was evil in the air.
And speaking of those songs, several of them were written by Richard O'Brien and Richard Hartley, who were of course known for the Rocky Horror Picture Show. It was supposed to have a US theatrical release, but the distributor went out of business just a couple of days before the film's opening and ended up just being released on the home market a little later on. It was actually a huge flop at the time and making very little money in the US and also in its home market of Australia, but has since developed its own cult following. And this is fun. It's a 3 from me. It's kind of convoluted and doesn't work at all, but there's just something about it that wins you over, and Arkin seems to be having a really good time. Its significance is just a 2 though, since it went almost completely unsung and definitely didn't change the genre at all, but it's got a nice cast and earned a small following. Should you watch it? Yep, but don't really expect to get the songs caught in your head.
I'll fight until I find the world I knew.
So this is one that doesn't have a set release date. It's only known to have been released at some point in 1983, and it's The Passing. It starts the old-fashioned way with a man peeing into a creek. And then there's Wade here, and I hear somewhere that he loves Monica. And it appears as if they've had some good and bad times together, and he's attacked by a group of hoodlums, winds up arrested. Meanwhile, that peeing guy is named Ernie. He's friends with Rose and takes care of him. They served in World War II together like an old married couple. They have some wacky shenanigans like Ernie stealing pajamas for Rose and some grand theft auto, and he even gets questioned by the police. While there, he encounters Wade, and he's on death row because a man raped his wife, so he got revenge and killed the guy in a particularly gruesome manner. Now, up until this point, you're probably wondering why this is considered sci-fi, since it's mostly 2 stories about people and ruminating on getting old and dying. But Ernie gets referred to this new program for old people. He signs up to find out that they're doing some sort of experimental testing there. Also, Wade trains in his execution for volunteering for their program, and they strap him into a high-tech machine that wipes his mind and his eyes. And then there's the equivalent of a cinematic drug trip as Ernie becomes a test subject himself, and holy cow did this get weird, but it's also incredibly interesting. It was essentially a one-man show from a man named John Huckert, who wrote the film, directed it, co-produced, edited, and plays Wade. He shot it on a shoestring budget of around $100,000 in the Baltimore area, and it was said to have taken him 7 years to complete it. During that time, the actor that played Ernie, James Carroll Plaster, died, causing some restructuring of the film's storyline. There was also said to be a subplot involving a viral outbreak that was treated comically, but as work continued, the AIDS epidemic kicked in, and Huckert realized that making a joke about outbreaks probably wasn't the best idea, and those scenes were cut out of the film. They also lost locations along the way, as a house that they were filming in burned down, a bar burned down, and the building that the opening scene takes place in was knocked down 1 day after they shot. And this is a solid 3.5. It's more like a 3.75, but not quite a 4. It's just so strange, and it has this awesome quirky charm to it. Sure, it's a bit rambly and lags for a while with no clear point, but I thought this was damn cool. Its significance is just a 1 though, since it's basically completely unknown, and no one went on to do anything more in the field. Should you watch it? Yes! Don't pass this one.
Are we dead yet?
No, just out of gas.
Well, here's another one that doesn't have a confirmed release date and is just known to have come out sometime in 1983, but possibly may have been released in 1982 as well, and it's Attack of the Super Monsters. The opening tells us that in the year 2000, suddenly dinosaurs reappeared. And I guess they talk now?
The Earth is ours!
And they start laying waste to everything under the command of Emperor Tyrannos. And meanwhile, cartoon humans chase bunnies, and he makes normal dogs into evil dogs, and I guess, yeah, the humans here are animated, while the attacking dinosaurs are hand puppets and guys in suits. And then there's the Gemini team, a sort of Voltron force, and like literally Voltron force, because there's generic guy, girl, chubby guy, and nerdy guy. They're just missing other generic guy, but their leader is, I don't know, Hitler. And yeah, they go after the crazed dogs, and their vehicles are all done in live action. They have to then face off against the dinos as well, at times mixing the live action and animation. And okay, the team members can then combine into Gemini, and they're linked together but can only stay that way for 3.5 minutes. So it's basically Voltron / Ultraman here. And they manage to stop the dogs, but then another dinosaur just sticks a bunch of bats on them. But then, after they stop them, it switches to rats. And yeah, by now you're probably noticing that this all seems a bit episodic. Well, that's because this is actually a re-edited series of 4 episodes of a Japanese TV show called Dinosaur War Eisenborg. It ran from 1977 to 78 and had 39 episodes. These were the very first 4. And even though it looks like they cut together clips from a live-action show and an animated one, that's just how the actual program was. And that format means that this didn't really have a plot, since no major alterations were done to the episodes outside of shortening them up a touch. So it does seem like you're just watching a couple episodes of a show. It did get enough credit to get riffed on by the guys at Riff Tracks, though. And I'm just giving this a 2, and a 2 is for the dinosaur stuff, which is amazing, because it's these awesome puppets just yelling destroy humans and stuff. And they're great. Its SFCS is a 1, since it's relatively unknown and it's just repackaged to TV. Should you watch it? Just check out 1 episode and see if you enjoyed enough to keep on going, I guess.
Here, Your Highness.
Ready? Now!
I obey!
This block has had some international flavor. France, Australia, Japan, but now we're headed to Hong Kong for February 5th to check out Zoo, Warriors from the Magic Mountain. Zoo is a mountain that's very mysterious and also home to amazing warriors, because that's what the title is. And we're in the middle of a civil war back in the 5th century. Yun Biao, one of the megastars of the Kung Fu cinema at the time, is here and ends up on the run from an army trying to kill him, and meets up with Sammo Hung, another of those megastars, and these two work together pretty frequently. They end up in a battle between rival gangs in color-coordinated outfits, and while fleeing, T ends up on an underground altar taking on supernatural opponents. He's rescued by a man in white and asks to be his pupil, but then these guys show up to help with their cool headwear. And they're heroic, but don't get along with Master Ding, and they're attacked by Satan worshippers, leading to another big special effects-laden fight. And these guys are the Warriors of the Magic Mountain, and T tags along as they navigate the caverns and come up against the Blood Devil. Also, this guy with animated eyebrows. Turns out that they only have a limited time to go to find the dual swords and use them to stop that old blood devil, or else the world is basically cooked. And this is by Choi Hark, and we've covered one of his earlier movies back in 1980 with We're Going to Eat You. And if you don't know him, he's been referred to as the Steven Spielberg of Hong Kong, and would go on to do the Once Upon a Time in China series, and even did his time in American action films with the thrilling team-up of Van Damme and Rodman in Double Team. This was based on a novel from 1932 called Legend of the Swordsman of the Mountains of Shu that has been adapted a number of times now for different films and television series. Since elaborate practical effects were dominant in American horror this time, this movie incorporates that, using them in a more fantastical manners. And Hark even brought over several American effects artists to contribute their work. It was a smash hit, earning a ton of money, and got 5 nominations from the Chinese equivalent of the Oscars, including Best Film, although it didn't win any. It's now considered one of the key films of what's referred to as the first wave of the Hong Kong New Wave film movement, and is one of about 6 of Hark's films that are listed there. One person who had a bigger appreciation for it is none other than John Carpenter, since he directly credits this film as the inspiration for Big Trouble in Little China. And it's amazing because you can certainly see that influence, but it never feels like it's just copying this. And I give this one a 3.5. It's just such a beautiful mess. And this movie just keeps tossing stuff at you like it's saying, and then this, and then this, and then this. And then it just never feels like it all gels, but it's a straight up blast. Its significance is a 2.5 since it did get a reputation and influence a lot of filmmakers, but it's never gotten this sort of mainstream recognition it could have, and just remained an international curiosity. Obviously, it's of more note in its native country, but just not so much here. Should you watch it? Yes, climb this mountain today. On that very same day, we're keeping things international and now headed over to Italy for Thor the Conqueror, which I'm assuming is not an official part of the MCU, right? This has a pregnant woman, and yep, there's a prophecy about that child, which is literally how every single sword and sorcery film starts, and little Thor is born. Well, then someone just shoots him with an arrow. A baby. His mom and dad are then killed, and it turns out that Thor was okay, and he was raised by a guy named Tisha. And he's now this burly dude that looks like someone cosplaying the Saturday morning cartoon version of Conan. They encounter some people being taken as slaves, and I guess Thor has never seen other people?
Female? What's a female?
And he rescues her, but instead of just setting her free, he takes her captive for himself. And Edna proves to not exactly be the best role model.
The female is stupid. Have your way with her. Take her.
He then has to go on through a series of tests and fight various creatures and whatever these are, and oh no, a skeleton! And then some warrior women, and he kills a couple, and I guess rapes one and takes her captive. And like, this is interesting watching the villain for so long, but when are we going to meet the hero of the film? Oh, he is the hero. He's the main character. Oh boy. But he's then captured himself, and Eno saves him, so they become an item, because up until this point, he's been total boyfriend material. And you'll notice that I haven't really talked all that much about the plot of this one, and that's because at this point, we're like an hour in, and there hasn't been one. But eventually, Thor has to fight against Gnut, the man who killed his father. And yeah, at this particular point in time, it was Conanimania. Everyone, especially everyone in Italy, was trying to offer up their own version of the Barbarian. We've covered several already, and there will be a whole lot more after this. But this one says that it's by Anthony Richmond, but that was just a pseudonym used by Tonino Ricci. And he also directed a movie that I recently featured on the horror version of the project, Bacterion, or Panic. There's really no budget information about this one, and not much about the box office either, although it's certainly not spoken about much and has slipped through the cracks of all the other films that were basically just like it at the time. And I'll give this a 2. It's so freaking slow and nothing happens, but it's so goofy and dumb that it's at least kind of fun. I mean, the movie begins with a baby being shot by an arrow, and it somehow lives. Its significance is just a 1, since no one talks about this, and it's only ever mentioned when people are talking about Conan ripoffs. Should you watch it? I mean, there are other movies called Thor that are more entertaining, so probably stick with those. We're going to stay in Italy for the film that ends this block, and it arrived on February 10th over there and made it to the States a little later, on August 19th, and it's Your Hunter from the Future. And it begins with this theme song to let you know how amazing it's going to be. We meet our barbarian-ish hero, and it's 70s Steve Rogers. And then there's this nearby clan of cave people, and Kala and her father come face to face with this Triceratops, and it's outstanding. I love this thing, and I want to name it Curtis. Well, Yor kills Curtis and is pretty happy about it. And he's welcomed into the tribe. Of course, now, by the sacred formula of all sword and sorcery movies, a group of marauders have to arrive and destroy the village. And what do you know? They do. Most of their people are wiped out, and Yor takes Kala back to his cave, and they talk about his mysterious medallion that he wears that he says he's had since he was a baby. When she gets taken away by the cave dudes, it's up to Yor to rescue her and get a bit of revenge for the villagers. And hey, remember like 3 minutes ago when I said that everything was a Conan ripoff around this time, especially with Italian films? Well, this is another one of those. Or is it? And then the plot thickens when they find a woman who is wearing the same necklace as Yor, and they determine that they're part of a lost race, which causes some love triangle shenanigans. But then it becomes clear that this is quite different than all the other movies that have appeared here featuring buff dudes in loincloths. First up, it has those dinosaurs, and they're great. But then there's futuristic radios and laser blasts, eventually leading to a city of advanced tech with a bunch of stormtroopers and a bad emperor-like guy named Overlord, played by John Steiner, who we just saw a little bit ago in the horror project in Tenebrae. And believe it or not, this is based on an Argentinian comic book called Yor from 1974, and it was adapted by director Antonio Margheriti, who we've also covered over on the horror stuff with Cannibals in the Streets. Reb Brown was cast and said that the shoot was particularly grueling, and he did all of his own stunts. And without any gym or equipment to work out with in the remote locations, he had to do over 1,000 push-ups and sit-ups each day to keep up his physique. It was so rough on the guy that he ended up losing around 30 pounds. It was made pretty cheaply and actually did quite well, earning almost $3 million in the US, and Margheriti claimed it was his most profitable film. It got shredded in the reviews and even got itself nominated for 3 Razzies, although it didn't win any. Over time, though, it's earned itself a massive cult following for its weird mixture of Conan and Star Wars, an aspect that wasn't in the comic, by the way, and is considered a film that's so bad, it's great. Besides that, though, it's definitely made a name for itself for the best use of Barbie dolls. Oh, and by the way, almost all of Brown's dialogue would end up being dubbed over, and one of the more bizarre moments was when he shouts "good" at Kala's dancing, although on set, Brown was simply burping.
Good!
And oh boy, what fun this is. I give it a 3.5. It's maybe a bit laggy in the middle, but the setup is fun, and that wonky finale is a trip. Its SFCS is a 2.5 since it's earned itself a nice-sized fan base, but let's face it, it's still very niche, and it didn't really make that big of an impact on the genre. Should you watch it? Yes, after all, it's Yor's world. And I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but he's the man. We're starting this block with one that didn't have a set release date and is just known to have come out in 1983 in Italy, but it did get an American release in 1984, and it's I Sette Magnifici Gladiatori, or the Seven Magnificent Gladiators. We begin with a couple of dudes on the hunt for a witch named Anakora, and this guy with this vaguely Zardoz-like outfit is an evil warlord, making a nearby town give him offerings or he'll destroy their village. He leaves, claiming he'll be back for his prize, and local girl Pandora decides that she must do something. She's Carla Ferrigno, wife of Lou, and this was her very first acting work. And Anakora unveils the Sword of Achilles and decides to go search for warriors to help them defend the town. If you grab the sword and are unworthy, you get a shock and I guess pass out. They come across a charioteer, a Hull, and he's a bit of a badass, but Sturba, werewolf bitch, is also on hand, so let's count down how long it takes before they get her top off. Han declines to kill his opponent, which ticks off the Emperor, so they decide to condemn them both to death, but Pandora saves them with the sword and tosses it to Han. He and Scipio join their crew, as does Julia, and along the way they encounter a big dude named Goliath that also signs up. There's also this sneaky thief guy that tags along, and the group head back to the village to prepare for the evil Nisarote's return. If that basic plot structure sounds familiar to you, that's because this is like a sort of a take on the classic Japanese film, The Seven Samurai. That film has been remade over and over again in a variety of genres. The most famous was the Western, The Magnificent Seven, but there was also the sci-fi space version, Battle Beyond the Stars. That one also featured Sybil Danning, basically playing a similar role here. So, I guess you could call this a ripoff. An Italian ripoff. And when you say Italian ripoff 3 times, Bruno Mattei magically appears like Beetlejuice. And yep, he directed this one, eager to jump in on the Conan craze that was going on. But he's not the only notorious name here behind the scenes, because, like a bunch of Mattei rips, the script was by Troll 2 director Claudio Fragasso. So, the pair were meant to be handling a version of Hercules at this time, and it was reported that they would do it, and Ferrigno was attached, but Lou was the only one to win to do it. And we'll talk more about that one a little later on in the year, but that was filmed back to back with this one, which went into production first. It didn't get a lot of attention and was criticized for being perhaps too direct of a remake, although it has gone on to a cult success. And I'm giving this one a 3. It's pretty fun, although I admit that it's nothing special and ends up being predictable if you know the plot of Seven Samurai. Its SFCS is just a 2 since it's not all that well known and is rarely discussed, but it does have some recognizable names attached and Mattei and Fragasso on hand. Should you watch it? I mean, Sybil Danning's in this, so yeah. Let's go back to an entry with a known date, and we're moving to the small screen for February 27th, Starflight, the plane that couldn't land. We have Barney Miller as a plane designer, and he created the Starflight, the first ever hypersonic transport. But he has doubts, even though they're a day away from launch. He wants to postpone, but they're worried that that'll cost him, so they ignore him. The Countess is here, so hands off, and the pilot may be a fall guy, and his marriage is a bit rocky. But that's not all, because Bernie Lomax is here too, looking lively, and so is Peter Jason. The time of the big flight arrives, and it launches, and look at all the guys in suits. I know that this is a movie, but it's the truth that people used to dress up to fly. It was like an occasion. But this was before the airlines all made sure to let you know just how much they hate you. But then, Freddie, a TV satellite CEO, has to scrap a rocket launch, and they detonate it, and a bunch of debris from it heads straight for the Starflight. They have to climb higher to avoid it and get to a point where they're in anti-gravity. And there's hull damage, so they need a team to go up and refuel them. Turns out that it's not that easy, so they have to get Josh down to Earth to help them with the problem. And that just leads to complications, and dudes getting sucked out into space. But then they have a limited amount of time and air, so they have to figure out how to get everyone down. But to do that, they have to get Josh down first to talk to the NASA guys, and he has to do that on Earth, even though they have a direct media link up and we're broadcasting live, but he has to go to Earth to talk to Shore. And this one was an ABC Sunday night movie and was directed by Jerry Jameson. And TV movies were his whole jam. We just saw him over on the Horror Project with the Linda Carter film Hotline, and he seemed to sort of specialize in these sort of disaster movies since he did Airport 77, Terror on the 40th Floor about a big building fire, Hurricane about a hurricane, and Heat Wave, a movie where everything gets really, really hot, otherwise known as Right Now. This one was primarily based on a book called Orbit, and it had the same basic plot setup, but changed around most of the other details. And what's funny is that this got released in some other countries, and a few that this was released as part of the Airport franchise, tagging it as Airport 85. And this was fine. It's a 2.5. It's basically any one of those airport movies, but in space. It has fun moments, and the cast is great, but it's really nothing new. Its significance is a 2, since it's not that well known, but it did have a big cast, and did alright in the ratings at the time, but just never really had any staying power. Should you watch it? Maybe. It's not bad, but it's pretty forgettable. We are now headed over to France for a film that debuted there on April 6th and didn't get a US run until 1984, and it's Le Dernier Combat, or The Last Battle. We meet a man in a sort of a post-apocalyptic wasteland scavenging auto parts, trying to put together some sort of vehicle. No one can talk, and this gang of dapper guys are holding this guy hostage in order to crawl into small spaces to retrieve water. Our hero, known simply as The Man, sneaks into the gang's camp and kills their leader to take a car battery, causing them to chase after him, but he uses that battery to finish his plane and flies away. But then, there's a professional here, and when the man's plane crashes, he's forced to continue on foot. Things get a little weird though as it starts raining fish, but then the man brawls with the brute and winds up in the care of a man called the Doctor. With the use of a gas, the Doc is able to say a single word, bonjour, and after some struggle, the man is able to say it back. But then it turns out that someone else is there, a woman, and the brute repeatedly is trying to get inside. And this was the first feature film from Luc Besson, who would then go on to make the cult hit Subway, and his breakthrough The Big Blue, and then his international sensation La Femme Nikita, before crossing over, making American hits like The Fifth Element. It would also mark the beginnings of his long collaboration with Jean Reno, although the two had already worked together on a short film. It marked a pretty sharp contrast to the Mad Max style of post-apocalyptic sagas that were cropping up everywhere at this time, and instead of giving us a violent series of chases, instead dealt with the human aspect of it. As opposed to those other films giving us very loud and frenetic encounters, this is very much the opposite and focuses on a number of quiet moments. Very quiet. There are literally 2 words spoken through the course of this entire movie. It got some strong reviews, with most praising its simple storytelling and ability to convey a strong story without dialogue, and went on to win several awards at a number of festivals, which nabbed it an American release. And this is pretty damn interesting. I'll give it a 3.5. It's one that I don't see myself rewatching very often, but it was cool to see a whole film done with no dialogue and just told through actions. Its significance is just a 2, though, because it's pretty damn obscure, although it's Besson's first film and had Reno in it, but it's not much talked about unless you're specifically seeking out the director's older work. Should you watch it? Yes. Quietly. Okay, hope you're ready for this next one because I'm not sure that I am. And this one didn't have a set release date, and it's only said to be released in 1983, and it's The Prodigal Planet. We find out that the nuclear war has ravaged the entire planet, and a man named David Michaels is being held by the government and told to renounce his faith. And besides the Bible quote at the beginning of the film and mentions of the word Lord several times in the first 5 minutes, it's clear that this is a Christian film. And if that stuff didn't tell you, then the awkward opening music would.
Your only hope is Jesus.
David is rescued by a woman from the Believers Underground, and she recruits him for a mission to take a module to the Underground. And he takes her to meet a guy named Matthew Turner in this big battle truck looking thing. And it seems that like they know each other, and I'll come back to that in a bit. They talk about God's plan and judgments that they've been living through for several years, and that there's new plagues on their way. There's boils coming, bloody seas, heat, darkness, and rivers drying up, then hail, and a big battle. And it's said that during that battle, Jesus will return and fix everything. And like isn't his dad all powerful? Isn't there a quicker and easier way to do that? Along the way, they find a mother and daughter, and this mom didn't get raptured because she devoted her life to that most blasphemous of careers, scientific research. How dare she? Everyone follows the Antichrist here, planning on overthrowing God, and soon enough those pesky plagues start happening. And this was actually part 4 of a series called A Thief in the Night, which was sort of a precursor to Left Behind, in a way. Like, this is the finale of the saga, with the first film called A Thief in the Night from 1972, and then A Distant Thunder in 1978, An Image of the Beast in 81, and I suppose I could have covered that here back on the 81 episodes, but I thought I missed it. And the character of David Michaels was introduced in the previous film, with the character of Matthew Turner appearing in all 4. This one was released in 2 parts, screening at a number of Christian drive-ins and churches. They would do a 2-part thing where the first hour was shown one night and the second hour shown the next because, yep, this sucker is 2 hours long. It originally wasn't intended to be the ending of the series as they were planning a 5th film called The Battle of Armageddon, but it never made it to the production phase. And oh man, this is boring. This is a 2, and it gets a little extra because of the fun Mad Maxy stuff, although there's really not enough of it. But it's just so dull. There's literally a 15 to 20 minute section where they sit around and discuss Bible passages. Its SFCX is a 1.5 since it's not that well known, and even those that know this series barely know this entry. Should you watch it? I mean, if you're rusty on your Bible passages and want a refresher, maybe?
Unit 616, go ahead.
Oh man, MCU has really gone downhill. We're now going back over to Italy for one that came out there on April 10th and got a US release in January of 1984, and it's one I've recently covered on a video of Mad Max ripoffs, and it's The New Barbarians, also known as Warriors of the Wasteland. It begins in 2019, and there's a nuclear war that destroys most of humanity, leaving only a barren wasteland in its wake. There's this tiny settlement, and they're attacked by a group of marauders called the Templars, who attack them with laser beams. Their leader is a dude named One, played by George Eastman, who we just saw in the Bronx Warriors, so Mad Max clones were his jam. And I guess in a counterpart to the last movie,
Books.
But then we meet our hero, Scorpion, who pulls up in a car that has a bubble roof, and here's a pretty inside joke. He meets a zombie from the movie Hysterical.
What difference does it make?
He encounters the famous Bob, and he once again has a ridiculously inappropriate voice.
Hey, I can't believe you've come here like only to play.
Seems that Scorps used to be a member of the Templars, but left them behind. He rescues a woman named Alma, and is watched by an inglorious bastard, who we just saw in the Bronx Warriors, and also Warrior of the Lost World, so he really liked Mad Max clones. And when I covered that film in the last episode, I said that he was in Italy making a movie, and then asked to be on that one in order to extend his visa, and this is that movie. Like the Road Warrior, Scorpion agrees to help out a small caravan and protect them from the Templars, except he gets captured. And this movie does something that I'm pretty sure that not many action movies have done. The hero is tied up and sodomized by the villain of the film. And this was by Enzo Castellari, and yes, he also directed The Bronx Warriors and was known to capitalize on current trends. He made The Last Shark, possibly the biggest Jaws ripoff there is, and was really in a post-apocalyptic mode here, as this was one of 4 or 5 films he did that were pretty similar. The budget was incredibly low, and the time factor was very limited. It's said that the 3 Mad Max ripoff films Castellari did in this time frame, this, Bronx Warriors, and Escape from the Bronx, were all completed in 6 months. Total, from writing to completion of filming. Even though it wasn't singled out by censors, the company that distributed the film decided to tone down Scorpion's rape scene, although future releases would restore it to its full version. And this is okay, it's a 2.5. It's mostly the same stuff we've seen before, but a touch duller. But it does have its moments. Its significance is a 2, since it sort of blends in with the other number of films from this same theme, from this same time period, and didn't really leave an impact. Should you watch it? Possibly. I mean, it's not a bad one. I like some of it, but it's not essential viewing at all. Here's one that got a premiere on April 15th, my birthday, in Boston. So it feels like it's a gift to me. But it got a little bigger and still limited release on July 20th. And get ready for Rock and Rule. We find out that there was a big war and only animals survived, and they mutated. And since then, a guy named Mock, who is also a rock star, is looking for a magic voice to complete some dark experiment to raise up a dark being from another realm. He's looked all over and can't find it, but then stumbles into a dive bar in Little Ohmtown, where a rock band is playing with Omar, Angel, Dizzy, and Stretch, and Omar is voiced by Paul Lamont. Well, if you're in the US, and we'll come back to that. When they play music, it's actually Cheap Trick, but when Angel does her solo thing, it's Debbie Harry, or Blondie, I guess. Did you call her Blondie when she's not performing with Blondie? Turns out that Angel's voice is exactly what Mock is looking for, so he calls him up to his mansion, where he offers her a spot on his tour without the rest of the band. When she turns him down, he kidnaps her and drugs the boys and kicks them out, so they have to head up to New York to try to stop him. Meanwhile, Mock discovers that his plans can be ruined by the magic of one voice and one song. But whose voice? And whose song? And along the way, there's more music, notably from Lou Reed and Iggy Pop, and eventually Earth, Wind & Fire. And this animated treasure is from Clive A. Smith. And he had done a few things before this that were also animated, and would continue on in this world doing some TV episodes and animated features, but then really switched into producing them, and was a huge force behind dozens of animated shows. It was from a company called Nelvana, and it was their first animated feature, although they had previously done the notorious Boba Fett bit from the Star Wars Holiday Special. But then they shifted to sticking to kids' TV, like the Care Bears and Babar and such. It was originally created as a kids' film called Drats, but over time they decided to switch to a more mature tone and make the characters more human than animal. It was really expensive for a small studio and cost around $8 million, going $3 million over budget and straining Nelvana until they nearly went out of business. Originally, they wanted a star name like David Bowie or Tim Curry to play Mock, and even considered Michael Jackson and Sting, but then decided that they couldn't afford them and hired Don Franks. Also, some of Stretch's lines were originally done by Howie Mandel, but he then moved to Los Angeles and didn't have time to complete the work, so Greg DeFell was brought in to finish the job and redo all the lines. Fun fact, one of the characters that's in the film for a short bit is voiced by Catherine O'Hara during her SCTV days. But then, problems arose when MGM picked it up for distribution and objected to a couple of things. They added a new bit to the beginning to explain why the people were part animal and toned down the language. But, most importantly, they hated Greg Salata as the voice of Omar and had him recast redoing all of his lines. In the end, though, they had no confidence in the film and only gave it a tiny release where it managed to earn a whopping $30,000. There was a comic book tie-in that was basically just stills from the movie, though, and I used to have that. I wish I still did. Since then, it's gained a pretty solid cult following due to some cable runs and passionate fans. And sadly, due to the contracts of the recording artist and the lack of interest in promoting the film, there's never been an official soundtrack release, which is a shame because it's damn good stuff. And man, do I love this. I'm giving it a 4. It's a little wonky at times, but the songs are great. The animation's awesome, and I dig it. Its SFCS is just a 2 though, since it's very cult, and that cult ain't that big, but it did cement Nelvani, even if it did almost kill them. Should you watch it? Hell yeah! Do it for Uncle Mikey. This next one is actually a South African film, but got a premiere in the US on April 29th and had a run in its native country later on in August, and it's Survival Zone. It's in the far-off future of 1989, and a voiceover tells us that nuclear war has destroyed the world, and there's only pockets of survivors left. And we meet hunky, shirtless Adam, and his family is all dead now. There's these roving motorcycle gangs playing jousting with chains and killing each other for fun. There's also a nearby convent that they attack, killing everyone, and come across their leader, and who's Big Man. And you know he's big because the back of his jacket tells you. He's mad because the women all kill themselves before they can get their hands on them. There's also a farm where the guy who's not Dave from 2001 is here, and they're trying to find other survivors. And they have a young girl there and a little boy as well. Soon, though, those bikers find the farm and try to defend themselves, but they're outgunned and manned. And when they try to head out, they run headlong into Adam. He agrees to help them and reveals that the gang are cannibals and ate all the nuns, while Rachel eyes him up like a box lunch herself. And I don't know how much of a compliment I would take that. Like, on one hand, she's looking at you like you're the only man she's seen in 3 years, and on the other, you're the only man that she's seen in 3 years that she's not related to. Together, they all decide to take a stand, and this one is from a guy named Percival Rubens. He only directed a handful of films, but started back in the mid-60s. It was from South Africa and was clearly yet another one that was inspired by The Road Warrior, although this version of a post-apocalyptic world is about as low rent as it gets, as everything just sort of looks like it normally does. Like, this is supposed to be after a nuclear war destroyed everything and killed everyone just a couple of years ago, and no one's worried about fallout or radiation or whatever. And this is just a bore. It's a 1.5. Not much happens, and what does happen happens very slowly, and this movie can't even make a shovel decapitation fun. Its significance is just a 1 because it's not talked about, and mostly for good reason since there's not much going on here. Should you watch it? Easy skip. A month later, on May 20th, we're back in America with one that's a bit more familiar, and it's Spacehunter: Adventures in the Forbidden Zone. We're in deep space, and this sort of cruise ship is passing between a couple of suns and gets into an accident, and a number of escape pods make it to nearby planets in these funky helmets that seem incredibly impractical. However, the natives aren't friendly and immediately attack them. Meanwhile, a guy named Wolf gets a call from a very familiar sounding voice that may or may not have straightened the slinky.
And the police called from the 42 sector. You got 105 parking tickets. I think you should take care of that. And your ex-wife is looking for you. She hasn't gotten a check from you in 3 months.
Wolf finds out that there's a big bounty for retrieving the 3 surviving women. The backstory of the planet is that they were colonized in 2013 and had a massive plague in 2021. So, close enough. Wolf can't pass up all that money and touches down just in time to help out a small group of colonists fighting off a band of marauders. They kidnap the women and take them into the Forbidden Zone, so Wolf has to give chase, even though his robot companion is destroyed. He's not alone for long, though, because he encounters a thief who's not exactly pretty in pink here, and she tags along. And meanwhile, the women are taken away to be prepared for a guy named the Overdog. And hey, you're pointing that awful close, man. What is this, 3D or something? He then meets up with, hey, what do you know, another Ghostbuster, who's another rival hunter. And together, they have to try to get their bounty by facing down that Overdog. And it's good old Michael Ironsides, who we just saw over on the horror project with the Sins of Dorian Gray. And Egon and Winston aren't the only Ghostbuster links here, since it was also produced by Ivan Reitman as well, but it was directed by Lamont Johnson. He'd been directing for a long time, although there's not much in his filmography similar to this, either before or after. And even though it's not as blatant with the things poking at you, but this was actually made in 3D and was part of that small boom that was going on at the time. But Johnson wasn't the original director. Jean Lafleur was on board, but was fired after 2 weeks, as the studio was unhappy with what they were seeing. Because of this, changes were made to the film and script, although the cast seemed to prefer the new director, and things went very smoothly after that, with Molly Ringwald particularly happy as she thought her dialogue was crap in the original version, and Johnson asked for a number of changes for her. The budget was pretty beefy at around $14 million, and the release really pushed the 3D angle and had a strong opening weekend with a $7 million haul, but then fell dramatically and only ended up totaling around $16 million in the end. But that may have had something to do with the competition that arrived just 1 week later, which we'll talk about shortly. Oh, and also, if you blink, you'll miss him, but here's Colin Mochrie in his first film role ever, which he gets no points for, but it's okay because they're just made up anyway.
You can ask the chemists.
No, wait, you got me mixed.
And this is fun enough. I'm giving it a 3. It's a really very standard plot, but told in a fun enough way, and Ringwald and Hudson steal the show. Its significance is a 3 as well, since this was somewhat popular due to cable runs and video stores, but never really took off as a property, and had a bunch of names attached to it. Should you watch it? It's probably worth a trip into this zone, sure.
Okay, what did you do to this?
Emergency repair procedure number 1.
You kicked it?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's pretty easy to see why Spacehunter would have a tough time at the box office, because just a few days later, on May 25th, Star Wars Episode 6, Return of the Jedi, was crushing everything else. It begins shortly after The Empire Strikes Back, and that darn Empire is building yet another Death Star because everything went so smoothly with the first one. But think about it. Why wouldn't they? Oh no, you destroyed our giant space weapon, but we're this massive universe-spanning empire. We can make more, and more, and more. Since Han has been frozen in carbonite and sent to space gangster Jabba the Hutt, they first have to go and rescue him. And come on, why am I explaining the plot to you? Like, you've seen this before, right? I guess I will, though, because that's what we do. So, Jabba is this massive thing, and this is why I love this era. This thing is completely practical and took like 6 guys to operate. And it looks great. And every other film that they tried to have him in, they did him digital, and nothing is even close to as convincing as this is. And hey, speaking of unconvincing, this is one of the new versions, so we have to sit through this crap. But at least the Rancor is still the real deal, and we also meet the crazy Sarlacc pit. And they make this big deal about how it slowly digests you over 1,000 years, but like, first of all, they're people. They don't live that long. And secondly, starvation or thirst will kill them first, so that would only take like a couple of days, so it's not really that horrible of a death. But being digested slowly over about 48 hours, like, it just doesn't sound as imposing. I guess that they say that like the Sarlacc pit keeps you alive, or that doesn't make any sense. But then, this movie commits crime number 1, and that's the sort of random and anticlimactic death of supposed badass Boba Fett. This was because Lucas was unaware that the character was popular and simply saw him as a basic side character, and only discovered that people liked him after the film was released and audiences were bummed and regretted not giving him a more grandiose death. Also, Carrie Fisher was super unhappy about her role here, being jammed into a bikini for a big portion of the film, which she hated, thought he was joking when she was first shown the outfit. Audiences really loved it though. Later in the film, it commits its second huge mistake, and one of the more notorious ones. It introduces the Ewoks, cuddly teddy bears ripe for merchandising everywhere. In the original script, they were going to be Wookiees, but the decision was made to switch them from tall, long-furred things to short, fuzzy ones, most likely because it'd be more appealing to kids. So, before filming, Lucas asked Ivan Kershner to come back to direct, but since he had spent the last 2 years working with Empire, he declined. He also asked Spielberg, but there were issues with the Directors Guild that made that an impossibility. Then, things got weird since he also approached David Lynch, since he had just won an Oscar for The Elephant Man, but he said no, as he thought it was Lucas's thing. David Cronenberg was also considered, but he only wanted to work on movies that he himself wrote, and also passed. Apparently, Spacehunter's Lamont Johnson was also considered, but the role finally went to Richard Marquand, and he hadn't done much in the genre before, and wouldn't do a lot after either. He only made 3 more films after this before passing away in 1987. I should point out that the whole reason why Solo was frozen at the ending of the last one was because Harrison Ford was only contracted to do 2 movies, and they were unsure whether or not he'd come back for a third, and they wrote the bit in case he said no, but in fact expected him not to since his star had risen since then. The character wasn't even in the original script, but they eventually convinced him to come back, and Ford suggested killing Han off, sacrificing himself to save the others. But yeah, I mean, they ain't killing Han. Well, I mean, not here. It was originally going to be called Revenge of the Jedi, and a ton of the early marketing called it that, including posters. But a few months before, it was decided that Revenge wasn't something Jedis cared about, and swapped it for Return, which was his original working title on the script. The budget was beefy at around $40 million, but it was a massive success, earning that back in its opening week alone. Over its run, it earned over $250 million worldwide, and through several re-releases, has added to that total to bring it into around $500 million. And even though the reviews were pretty good, they weren't great, and fans weren't quite sold. The ending was considered too much a copy of the first film, and the Ewoks weren't quite Jar Jar hated, but they were pretty unliked. Except by kids. Kids freaking love them. And you know, I take offense to Dante from Clerks referring to them as a bunch of Muppets. Ewoks aren't Muppets, they're guys in suits. 2 different things. There's some Muppets in Jabba's palace, but you can't be mad about those because they're pretty badass. Also, this was considered the end of the saga and remained as such for around 15 years until the prequels arrived to crap all over its legacy. And I don't care if you guys have this new love for them now, because they sucked then and they suck now.
It's a trap!
And I'll give this one a 4. Again, I have no real passion for Star Wars. I liked it growing up, but then I lost interest, and it's never been a thing for me like it has been for others. That said, I love the first half of this one so much, and all the Jabba stuff is fantastic, and exactly what I want from these movies. The second half? Well, I mean, it's fine. And it's so uneven that I was going to give it a 3.5, but then that scene happens where the Ewok tries to wake up its dead friend, and I cried a little. I gave it a 4. Its SFCS is a 5. Come on, it's Star Wars. There's no way this was ever going to be anything but a 5. I don't even need to explain it. You get it. Should you watch it? You have, but do it again and fast forward through that new horrible Max Rebo segment.
What day?
Seriously, why would you do that to me? Our final film of this block came just 2 days later in Italy, even though it wouldn't release to the US until February of '84. And it's The Blade Master, although the original title is Ator 2, Orion the Invincible. It has a bunch of cavemen going nuts, but also this guy named Akranos telling his daughter about his new discovery, a device that he's afraid will fall into the wrong hands and be used as a weapon. He decides to call on Ator, and we get a recap of the first Ator movie, and then we catch up to our hero, once again played by Kilometers O'Keefe. Turns out that the evil Zor, who has one hell of a mustache and bangs combo going on that seems to recall the guy from the last film, is after the device, so Mila goes off to find the hunky Ator. She finds him, but is wounded while doing so he has to feel her up a bit to heal her. Like really, it's vital to his healing process that he have his hand on her bosom. Oh, and Ator has an assistant named Thong, and I didn't know he had such a cult following, but apparently this character has an entire Cisco song dedicated to him. They have to top the first film where Ator fights a literal shadow by throwing in a sequence where he takes on invisible opponents, so he literally just jumps back a few times? Like spare no expense, right? They then have to make their way back to the castle to save Akranos from Zor and retrieve the device, which is apparently called the Geometric Nucleus, facing down those cavemen and other shenanigans on the way. Of course, this is a sequel to Ator the Fighting Eagle, the film from just a handful of months ago. That one was a nice success, and its director Joe D'Amato had O'Keefe under contract, but only for a short amount of time. They decided to do a knockoff of Quest for Fire, a film about cavemen, and called it Adam and Eve. But as they were getting ready to do it, the actor backed out at the last minute due to religious reasons. Since they had that limited time for his contract, they rushed to do a sequel to Ator, putting it together quickly and starting to shoot with no script in place. This worked out since they were able to release the film around the time of Conan the Destroyer to cash in on the similarities. It's said that the film might have been released in Italy at the ending of 1982, although it's also been said that it only began shooting at the beginning of '83, and it's also said that it never had an official theatrical release there. It did get that US run in '84 as Blade Master, and also was retitled Cave Dwellers for some versions, and under that title it was featured in a pretty notorious episode of Mystery Science Theater 3000. It would be followed up by a third part, but not until 1987, and a fourth entry in 1990. And this is just a 1.5 for me. It's missing the silly parts of the original, and it's just a bunch of Barbarian-style cliches, and ends up just being sleep-inducing. Its significance is a 1.5 as well, since it's gotten a touch of notoriety and a small cult following, but it's still very much on the obscure side. Should you watch it? Nah, I mean there's lots of other Conan clones that are more worth it. We start this block in style because on June 2nd in Italy, we get a number that didn't arrive in the US until a year later in 1984, and it's Conquest. It begins in this dreamlike realm as we see young Ilias getting prepared to go on a quest and is given a magical bow and arrow as he passes into manhood. There's also the evil Okron, a mostly naked woman wearing a Destro mask, and she has werewolves with her. And these are some pretty complex fursuits, and they literally tear a woman in half. Okron has a vision of Ilias as a man with no face killing her with his bow, so she sends her crew after him, but he's helped out by Mace here, who swings his bone around. And I know how that sounds, but it is what he does. The two team up and head out into the realm with Ilias teaching Mace how to use the bow. They travel around for a while and get into a bunch of shenanigans, which mainly involve Ilias being a bitch. Like, he gets captured and Mace has to save him. And then they're attacked by what appears to be tons of hand-drawn arrows, and he gets stabbed by one, and Mace has to save him. To get a cure for the poison, he's gonna have to fight against some zombies though, and you probably should have expected zombies because this is by none other than our boy, Lucio Fulci. It was originally meant to focus more on the Mace character and was called Mace the Outlaw, but eventually changed things up. It was a joint venture between Italy, Spain, and Mexico, as Fulci just signed a 2-picture deal with a producer named Giovanni Di Clemente, but during the making of this film, the pair had a falling out, and Fulci refused to continue the contract the second the production was complete on this one. The producer was forced to then sue Fulci, but the director won out as the judge ruled that he could not be forced to work as per the Italian constitution. The second film was meant to be a horror flick called Alibi, but never even got to the scripting stage. Clearly, this was inspired by the wave of Conan knockoffs that was huge right around here, but you really can't call this a clone because it's distinctly Fulci and weird and features a number of bizarre creatures. It also has a unique look since the whole film was shot through a soft focus lens with a fog machine going constantly, creating this ethereal and dreamlike atmosphere throughout. It was unfortunately a bomb when it was released in Italy, and the reviews weren't all that kind, even though it was thought to be better than other Conan-style Italian flicks of the time. And those guys are crazy. This is a blast, and I'm going to give it a 3.5. It's just throwing everything at the wall here, and enough of it sticks, and that final act twist is just wild. Believe me when I say that you will never expect what happens to Ilias. Its SFCS is just a 2 though, since it's not all that well known outside of Fulci fans and doesn't even feature much in the way of his regular players. Should you watch it? It's a Fulci film, so of course.
Where is your friend?
I have no friends.
You lied! I will make you tell me! Angara Yoga!
A mere one day later, on June 3rd, we have a movie that premiered at Cannes a month earlier, but its release was June 3rd, and it's WarGames. Babe Ruth shows up for a second, and we see a couple of guys in this bunker that has pretty firm stances on where you can and can't urinate. And they do a test launch of nuclear weapons that one of the men can't bring himself to go through with. Meanwhile, at NORAD, Jack Flack is working, as is Barry Corbin, and I feel like he plays military guys a lot, and also the manager of the Sedgwick Hotel. They're worried that the humans couldn't bring themselves to go through with activating the missiles, so they're keen on introducing a computer that can, called the Whopper. And great, now I'm hungry. It's programmed to continuously run war scenarios in order to learn about war over time. We then meet Ferris Bueller, and he loves video games, and his classmate is Stephanie number 5 alive. He agrees to help her with her grades, and ready for a flashback? There's the modem he uses to dial into the school's computer. Now, for my younger audience, you used to have to call into another computer and literally use your actual phone, placing it on the modem. They eventually streamlined that so you didn't need to actually use a phone cradle, but it still needed a phone line. He's able to alter the grades online, although she won't let him, but he does it anyway, and then while trying to find a new connection, accidentally taps into Whopper. He goes to try to find out more information about what the connection is and talks to Eddie Deason, doing that one character that Eddie Deason does when he's not harassing waitresses, and also the head of the River Rats. David starts talking to the program, and it says it.
Shall we play a game?
And he challenges it to global thermonuclear warfare, inadvertently sending a warning to NORAD. The problem is that the program chooses to continue the game since it doesn't understand that it's affecting things in the real world. False data is fed to the Soviets, stoking the fires of an actual World War III. The FBI are able to track David, though, and bring him in, and it becomes a race against time to stop the game before the nukes start dropping. And this one was the culmination of a whole bunch of fears at the time, and brought to you by John Badham. And it's his first appearance anywhere on the project, but we'll see him again in the future. But by this point, he had already directed Saturday Night Fever, The Dracula with George Hamilton, and Blue Thunder. It was originally going to be directed by Martin Brest, who would eventually go on to make Beverly Hills Cop, but he was fired after 12 days of filming because his approach was considered too dark, and they wanted the film to have an element of fun. Badham was then brought on board and gave a lighter touch for the whole thing. The budget was fairly low at $12 million, and it would go on to be a massive hit, earning $125 million worldwide, and was critically acclaimed. It was even nominated for 3 Oscars, but it didn't win any, but it did get Best Director at the Saturn Awards. It was one of the first films to focus around hacking and sparked a massive increase in interest in it, and is even acknowledged as kicking off Ronald Reagan's administration to enact NSDD 145, a directive revolving around computer security. Also, I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but there's a sequel from 2008 that went straight to video called WarGames: The Dead Code. that involves a hacker facing off against a new program called Ripley, eventually using Whopper to combat it. It's, not good. And this is another 3.5, and this block is off to a great start. This may be a little overly long and doesn't have much to do in the middle, but it's still a cool story and a cool snapshot of a very specific time in history. Its significance is of 4, since it's a film that a large number of people saw, and it did really well, shaped actual policy, has a number of known names in it, but never really established itself as a huge mega blockbuster or anything. Should you watch it? Yes. A strange movie. The only losing move is not to watch.
How about a nice game of chess?
Now, about as far removed from that one as we can get, a movie debuted on the same day, June 3rd. It's The Man with Two Brains. We meet Dr. Har, played by some jerk, and he's also a brain surgeon. There's also Joan Wilder. The Joan Wilder? And she's a wicked woman tormenting her husband, and the doc accidentally runs her over. He then proceeds to operate on her, but hey, there's another doctor on hand, Dr. West. The operation is a success and they get married, but her manipulations start right away. She won't have sex with the doc and is boning the gardener.
Ready the bone wax. Benson bomb scissors.
Benson bomb scissors.
That cat out of here.
Yes, sir.
The pressure starts to get to him, and you can't trust this guy since he was terrible to Sarah Connor. And it appears as if there's a series of brain thefts going on. Michael meets up with Sark, who wants to show him this innovative experiment that he's developed, but then there's also a mysterious elevator murderer killing women by injecting them with cleaning fluid. Doc Necessiter has a selection of brains in jars, and his plan is to develop the first ever brain transplant, and he's using brains of victims of that killer. His butler is the Jefferson's neighbor, and then something strange happens. One of the brains starts talking to him, but he's the only one that can hear it. And it's a woman named Anne. If her voice sounds sort of familiar, it's because that's an uncredited sissy SpaceX. And Michael then ends up forced to deal with the manipulations of Dolores while having a secret affair with Anne, or Anne's brain. And no one can know about it, not even Zephram Cochrane. And this was the third project that paired Steve Martin with director Carl Reiner, and they had previously done The Jerk and Dead Men Don't Wear Plaid. But Martin actually originally wanted someone else to direct. After seeing Scanners, the comic thought that David Cronenberg would be a great choice to handle the project. But Cronenberg wasn't interested in doing a comedy and was a little bit busy with Videodrome at the time. Turner was excited to take the gig since it was a about-face from the steamy, sexy roles that she had been doing and allowed her to be more comedic, even though she hated the scene where her character is paid by a man to touch her ass and requested a body double, which she says is the only time she used a body double for a sex scene. It had some nice reviews at the time, although none of them were overwhelmingly glowing, and it did fair in ticket sales, earning around $10 million. Since then, it's taken on a reputation for being an unsung comedy gem from Martin's filmography, even if it's a bit out of the ordinary for his work. And this is yet another 3.5, and this block is fun, and in terms of comedy, this is pretty uneven, but the stuff that lands hard. Plus, Turner is amazing in a comic role while also being crazy hot. Its significance is a 3 since it's fairly well known due to a massive amount of cable airplay back in the day and has a whole bunch of known players, but it's never been one of Martin's mainstream hits. Should you watch it? It doesn't take 2 brains to figure out that you should.
Hey, what does it do anyway?
It causes your brain to die last.
I don't mind. It's my voice. Damn.
This next one came out in the US on a limited release on June 10th and would get a wider release in its home country of Italy in March of 1984. And we've already covered 2019 after the fall of New York, so I guess make room for 2020 Texas Gladiators. It's a post-apocalyptic wasteland, of course, and I guess it's 2020, and yeah, this looks pretty much what I remember. There's this group of marauders, and they attack a convent and attack and kill everyone, and then a group of warriors called the Rangers show up to fight them off. and they rescue Maida, played by the White Cannibal Queen, Sabrina Ciani. But when Catchdog, one of their own, tries to force himself on her, he's outcast by the group's leader, played by Italian staple Al Cliver. It then jumps 5 years, and Nexus and Maida have a kid that has the most unrealistic voiceover. And they live in a little settlement while a group of bikers invade. They drive them off, but right afterwards, a different crew appears with more high-tech weaponry and wipe everyone out. Turns out that they're headed up by none other than Catchdog, and things take a turn when Nexus is gunned down. Maida is kept as a slave and soon encounters Holocron, and he's played by Peter Hooton. And you know what that means!
Hey bud, what happened to your clothes?
I got molested in the little boy's room.
Him and his crew help Maida, but then are taken to serve under the rule of the Black One, a cowboy-themed bad dude, and it's up to the Rangers to break free and take him down. And chalk this up as yet another Mad Max knockoff film, even though it's lacking the style and action of that and just doing post-nuke wasteland stuff. It was co-directed by Joe D'Amato and George Eastman, and we literally just encountered D'Amato in the last episode with Blade Master. It said that he only did the action scenes though, as the film was meant to be solely directed by Eastman, but since he was mostly an actor and not director, he wasn't very confident with doing the action scenes and asked Joe to step in and handle those, while he could work with the actors for the more dramatic scenes. He wasn't much of a fan of it though, and said that he only did these type of films for the money. The reviews on it were pretty rough, and it didn't make all that much of a splash, but it did get a smattering of airplay back in the day. And this breaks our streak because this is a 2. It's alright at times, but it's pretty boring for the most part, and it isn't giving me anything I haven't seen in any of the other Italian Mad Max clones. Its SFCS is just a 1.5 since it's mostly forgotten, and if it weren't for D'Amato being involved in a handful of Italian stars, it'd be a 1. Should you watch it? Like most things about 2020, you can do your best to forget it. When I decided that superhero stuff would qualify for the Sci-Fi project, I thought there'd be more, but really there hasn't been. But that's going to change on June 17th, because that's when Superman 3 came out. It starts differently as Montgomery Brewster is here, but he's not a millionaire yet. He's actually out of a job. We then get an extended comic opening as a beautiful woman walking down the street causes chaos by just walking and looking good, I guess. But Clark Kent is here too, again played by the awesome Christopher Reeve, and the Supes is back in action. And so is Jimmy Olsen. Gus has gotten a job with a computer programming firm and turns out to be a whiz at it. Lois Lane returns, as does Perry White, but Lois is sent on vacation to Bermuda and out of the film, and we'll talk about that in a bit. Meanwhile, Gus has found a way to collect millions of dollars by going into the future and watching Office Space, while Clark and Jimmy go to Smallville on assignment. Clark goes to his high school reunion and meets up with Martha Kent.
Why did you say that name?
You're right, I mean, Lana Lang. We then meet Pootie Tang's greatest enemy, Dick Lecter, and his sister, Granny Ruth from Basket Case 2 and 3. His girlfriend is that woman from the beginning, and fun fact, Pamela Stevenson was a cast member of SNL for 1 season. Baxter recruits Gorman to do some computer manipulation of the stock markets, but Superman intervenes. So here's where this one gets juicy. Gus tries to make a replica of kryptonite, but has to do it on the fly, and the synthetic creation has an unexpected effect in that it corrupts Superman, leading to one of the greatest superhero sequences of all time, the Junkyard Brawl. And after the massive success of Superman 2, it was clear that more were going to be made. Richard Donner said that he wrote out treatments for more films after the second one, and his concept for the third entry featured Brainiac. Other early plans involved Mr. Mxyzptlk and Supergirl, And one of them involved Superman and Supergirl getting married, so yuck, cousins, but I guess not in that continuity. Eventually, though, those were shot down due to being too expensive and also wanting Supergirl to have her own movie. Richard Lester was brought back on to direct, and the way that the Salkinds, the producers, treated Donner by firing him from the second film rankled some feathers. Because of that, Gene Hackman refused to return as Lex Luthor, although he later said that that wasn't true and he was just busy and thought that having Lex the villain of every movie was too repetitive. Kidder was also vocal about how they treated Donner, and it said that they punished her by only giving her a small role in this one, although again, the Salkinds denied that this was the case and said that they just wanted to focus on Lana Lang instead. Even Reeves said that he may not come back, and they considered replacements, reaching out to John Travolta, Kurt Russell, Jeff Bridges, though they all turned it down. There's even a rumor that they decided to cast Tony Danza, but Lester hated the casting and pleaded Reeves to return, which he finally agreed to. That's all unconfirmed, though. Pryor was brought on board when he went on Johnny Carson and talked about loving Superman 2, so they reached out to him, giving him a nice $5 million to appear in the film. The overall budget was a hefty $39 million, a bigger than normal price tag for this era, but unfortunately it was torn apart by critics who hated the more comedic stuff and the repetitiousness from the other two, and it was even nominated for a pair of Razzies. Audiences felt the same way, and it would only earn $80 million worldwide, and that doesn't sound too bad, but it did make a profit, but it was a patch on the box office of either of the earlier films, so it was clear that it was not as embraced. Reeve was unhappy with the results himself and said that after this, he would never play Superman again. Although he changed his mind later on when he was allowed to have more story input for Superman 4. There's a few other things to mention about this one, and I think it's the only Superman film in which there's definite confirmation that Supes gets laid. And when they say that they had a nice night together, he's all like,
I'm sorry, but that wasn't me.
But that is like...
And you're next, Webster.
But like, did he mean that Webster's next to have a night with him? Is he gonna bone Webster? But one last thing, you know that this gave you nightmares when you were a kid.
This?
And I know it's not a great film, but I still love it. I'm gonna go with a 3.5. It's bad at times, but also really enjoyable at others, and the face-off alone is worth the price of admission. Its significance is a 4, since it's a freaking Superman movie, and still one that was pretty notable and successful, even if it was less profitable and was very widely seen. Should you watch it? Yes, I mean, it's not bad. It's just in a slump.
Me and Superman?
We're headed back to Fantasyland now for a feature that arrived in Italy on June 17th and didn't get a US release at all, and it's Throne of Fire. It has a woman who is visited by a man claiming to be the emissary of hell and impregnates her. And when she gives birth, mystics know about it and say the child will try to sit on the Throne of Fire, and it has to within a certain time frame or it will be destroyed. Meanwhile, it's an ugly kid named Morak. Time passes with little Maury being groomed to kill Aegon and take the throne. Then, as is mandatory in the beginning of any sword and sorcery flick, a group of marauders lays waste to an entire village. Morak is running out of time to pop that squad, and he has to marry the Princess Valkyrie as well, as his men are on the hunt for her. And when we meet her, it's once again Sabrina Ciani, and she's captured. There's then our standard barbarian-looking dude who rolls up, and it's Pietro Torrisi, who we last saw in both Gunin, King of the Barbarians, and the Sword of the Barbarians, and here he's a dude named Siegfried. We finally get a look at the throne, and he's not allowed to sit there until after he marries Valkyrie, and oops, if you try to, you get ruined like a well-done filet mignon. I don't care if you like it well done. The whole point of filet is that it's the most tender part of the steak. If you get it well done, you're negating the whole reason for it and paid more for no reason. Meanwhile, Siegfried goes into action to try to save the princess and the day, even though Morak can't be killed by regular means. And by now, It's a straight up trend of Italian Conan knockoffs, and this is just another one of those, hitting most of the same notes. And it's from Francesco Prosperi, the same man who directed Teresi in Goonin, but he'd also previously worked with Ciani in White Cannibal Queen, which he co-directed with Jess Franco. This would end up being his final film, though, as he retired right afterwards. And this is fine, it's a 2. It just feels so been there, done that. And you've seen this all and done better. It's entertaining enough, I guess, but just not compared to all its competitors. Its significance is just a 1 though, since it's not talked about at all and blends in with all the others and doesn't really have that many known faces outside of cult Italian stuff. Should you watch it, you can probably leave this throne empty. Get ready for a weird one, because on June 23rd, on the small screen, we have a curiosity called Wishman. It has an experiment as they're creating some little thing in a lab run by a guy named Dr. Wish, and the thing controls electricity. Joseph Bottoms is on hands, and we just saw him in the horror project with the Sins of Dorian Gray. And they declare the experiment a failure and choose to dissect it. Alex decides that he's not about that, so he smuggles the little dude out of there. He takes Wishman to pick up his girlfriend, Sarah Connor, and when the Wishman is revealed, it's, this. They take this monstrosity to their friend's house to hide out, and they welcome him in as he sort of tries to figure out how to be an actual living thing, and that includes spying on Maddie in the shower, which she actually takes in stride and seems totally cool with. And right after he looks in on her naked, he wants to hop in bed with them? What kind of movie is this? Well, then they have to protect little Wishman from the government agents that are trying to get at him. And this is a pretty short TV movie. It's only about an hour long. And it was clearly a blatant E.T. knockoff. It was actually a pilot for a TV series that ABC wanted to run, and they were looking to have something that was piggybacking off of Spielberg's film's success. It was directed by James Frawley, and this guy was not some TV schlub director. He's the director of the original Muppet movie and The Big Bus, but yeah, also did Wishman. If you think that watching a movie called Wishman, you're going to see something about a little creature that grants wishes, think again, since his abilities are all electrical based instead. But alas, this wasn't meant to be, since the pilot never ended up getting picked up, and the film would slip into obscurity, only showing up on specials like Shows That Never Were and such. Linda Hamilton says that she's super glad this didn't get picked up, since she was contracted to do it and would have had to pass on doing the Terminator shortly afterwards. And I'm giving this a 2. It's pretty dumb and pointless, but the silliness when the little fella is on screen and the oddly sexual shenanigans are pretty humorous. Its SFCS is just a 1 though, since it's pretty ignored and is basically just a footnote on Linda Hamilton's IMDb page. Should you watch it? You can do what ABC did, just sorta forget it.
Okay, buddy, we got it.
The next month, on July 16th, we're headed over to Japan for a film that went by many titles, but the most common is apparently The Girl Who Leapt Through Time. But it was also The Little Girl Who Conquered Time, Girl of Time, The Girl Who Cut Time, and several others. We meet a couple of school friends on a skiing trip, and one of them is Kazuko, and they run into their friend who has lost his skis somehow. They head back home as they slowly regain color, and they go back to school. After class, they're assigned to clean the classrooms, but something knocks down a beaker of chemicals, and the smoke gets to Kazuko and she passes out. She's rushed to the nurses and seems fine, but when they go back to the lab, everything is fixed. But as they walk home, she notices something weird with a kid riding on his bike. She falls for Fukamachi and continues to have these visions, and one night, there's an earthquake. The next day, she's almost crushed by a falling roof, but it's just a dream. Or is it? Because then it seems like Kazuko is Groundhog Daying and reliving the same day over and over. But of course, this was before Groundhog's Day and was actually based on a novel from 1967. If some of the visuals look bizarre and that opening with the transition from black and white to color was odd, that's because this is from Nobuhiko Obayashi, the director of House and School in the Crosshairs. But this is the most linear film that we've seen from him so far. It's what's referred to as an idol film because the lead actress Tomoyo Harada was a singer and teen star. It was released to mixed reviews, but none of that mattered to the audience since it was a huge hit. It was the second highest grossing Japanese film of that year, and the theme song for the film received a ton of airplay in multiple versions. There would be several other versions of the tale, including an animated one from 2006 and another live-action take from 2010, although both of those lacked this one's over-the-top visual flair. And I guess I'm an Obayashi fan. This is a 3.5. Even when his plots are straightforward, he's doing such interesting things with the filmmaking and cinematography that it's just a joy to watch. This is probably my least favorite of the stories I've covered of his, but it's still really fun. Its significance is a 1.5 since it's not that well known outside of Japan, but had a bit of influence, although it's another that's likely that has more relevance in its home country than it does here. Should you watch it? Yes. You've got time. We're headed back to Italy now because ripoffs never sleep. This is one that arrived there on July 22nd and didn't get a US release until December of 1984, and it's another dated title with 2019 after the fall of New York. So we've already been to 2020 here, so let's see how close this one is. We're told by a voiceover that there was a massive war 20 years ago, so I guess back in 99, and due to the radiation, no kids have been born since then. And there's this group in New York called the Urax, and they're trying to figure out how to survive by doing tests on survivors that they find. There's a resistance fighting back against them though, although they're not doing that well. Meanwhile, in Nevada, Mad Max is here, or well, I guess someone with a very similar looking car, and he's involved in a death race. He wins and is rewarded by this clown, I guess, robot? His prize is a woman who we just saw in the new Barbarians, but he's then captured and taken to the president, the dean from Pieces. And he tells Parsifal that there's a fertile woman somewhere in New York, and he has to go in and retrieve her and get her out within 24 hours or a bomb will go off in his head, and whoops, a wrong movie. He's sent in with 2 agents, Bronx and Ratchet, and they run into trouble right away, getting captured. The Urax arrive, though, and take them to their base, along with a woman named Giara, but they escape only to fall into the hands of Big Ape, the leader of a group of mutants. He's played by Italian familiar face George Eastman. And together they have to break free and find that fertile lady. And this is yet another of the crop of films that popped up in the wake of The Road Warrior to be a post-apocalyptic wasteland film, although this throws in a very healthy dose of Escape from New York as well. In fact, I'd say it's more of the latter than the former, and it was from Sergio Martino. And this is the first time that we're seeing him here, but it won't be the last. One of the most interesting bits is that it bears some similarity to Children of Men, although it came around 20 years earlier, and a decade before the book that the film was based on. Not only does it share a plotline with a man searching for the last fertile human being, but both films feature a scene that has Picasso's painting Guernica hanging in the background. And I'll go with a 3 here. It feels a little like you've seen this all before, but it looks pretty cool, and the crazy twists it's throwing at you in the ending are wild. Its significance is just a 1.5 since it's obscure enough and doesn't really feature any known names, but it's gotten some attention as a ripoff film. Should you watch it? It's worth a look, yeah.
Stupid bastard!
We're staying overseas now and checking out Spain for a film that there was a joint venture between them, the US, and Italy, and it arrived on July 23rd there, and it's Hundra. And yeah, I mean, this whole block is feeling like clones. We meet a group of Amazons, and they're having trouble with making children. One of the members is Hundra, played by Laureen Landon, and they point out that she's still a virgin. She's set on keeping it that way. Then, do you remember a bit earlier when I said that like every sword and sorcery film started with a group of marauders invading a village? Well, a group of marauders invades their village, basically wiping everyone out. Hundra survives and escapes and fights back against a squad of the Barbarians. She then seeks out the castle of wise women to plan revenge, but instead, she tells her to go out and make babies to repopulate the Amazons. He heads out on a quest to find a suitable suitor or to get revenge, whichever comes first. The first guy that she considers is a rude, drunken lout who attempts to force himself on her, so she takes him out. Continuing on her hunt, at one point she falls off of a massive tower and ends up in the bed of a handsome healer. But there's still the problem of the local pagan priest to worry about as well. And yes, this is just another one to cash in on Conan. And this one was directed by Matt Kimber. And that name might sound familiar, but I have a feeling it's not for the string of low-budget flicks that he directed in the 70s and earlier 80s, like this one. No, you probably know him as the creator and director of Glow, the gorgeous ladies of wrestling. If you watched the Netflix show, Matt is the guy that Mark Maron was based on. And that background of bad movies that they always talked about in that show, well, this was one of them then. While shooting, Landon was big on doing all of her own stunts, and she did, with one exception, that fall from the tower, which was 180 feet down. She also opted for a stunt double for the nudity, but when she saw the footage of the woman that they chose, she was shocked to see that she was short and heavy set. Landon then said that she'd do the scene herself, as she didn't want people to think that that was her body. Claims that she believed that Kimber did that on purpose for that exact reason. It didn't get a lot of attention at the time, but it's since been regarded as one of the better Conan rips, and people praised the soundtrack by Ennio Morricone. And I like Hundra. I'll go with a 3 on it. It's entertaining and silly, and it's always moving, so it's never boring. And I like the flip-flop of having the badass warrior woman as opposed to the non-stop bland dudes that we've been getting in these. Its significance is just a 2, though, because it's not all that well known, even if its cult is growing a bit and it's earning more recognition. Should you watch it? Hundra, yeah! Let's end this block with something else that could probably be called sword and sorcery, but not really a Conan ripoff, and is debuted on July 29th, and it's Krull. It has this giant rock floating through space and settling down on a planet that doesn't appear to be Earth. We're told that it's the home of the Beast, and it has conquered many worlds with his slayers, and now it's here. Meanwhile, Lissa is marrying Colwyn in order to shore up an alliance between kingdoms, although they seem pretty into each other as well. Before they can seal the deal, the Slayers attack, and when they're killed, they make a very distinct sound. The wannabe stormtroopers win out, though, and take the princess with them, but Colwyn survives thanks to the help of Ynir, played by Freddie Jones, who we last saw in Firefox. He tells them to defeat the Beast, but then must seek out an ancient weapon called the Glaive, and they get it pretty easily, but then they have to find the Beast's fortress, as it moves around every day. Along the way, they meet Ergo, a magician, and a group of thieves that includes Hagrid, and the Dark Man, and a seer and his apprentice, and a Cyclops named Rel. They fight quicksand, doppelgangers, and a fantastic giant spider, losing several members on the way as they make their way to the Beast's castle to force a final face-off. And this began when Columbia Pictures president Frank Price decided that he wanted to do a fantasy film and called in producer Ron Silverman, which he jumped at. Multiple versions of the script were commissioned, including the original version in which the Beast was a dragon, and one that had a giant snake woman. As it was being made, there were rumors that it was actually meant to be a Dungeons & Dragons movie, but that was untrue. Peter Yates was brought on to direct, and this type of thing wasn't really his speed, as as he had just done Eyewitness, earlier the Peter Benchley tale, The Deep, and Mother Jugs and Speed. It was given a budget of around $30 million, making it a very expensive film for the time, but cheaper than Superman 3, but it was a risky venture for a property that no one had ever heard of. When they were done filming, Price was unhappy with Lissa's voice, said that he thought that audiences would prefer an American one, as opposed to one with an English accent, and hired Lindsay Krause to overdub all of her dialogue, although it's unclear if that's the reason why, or if he was just simply dissatisfied with her performance. Because of that, Lisette Anthony would state that she hated the film, but not only because of the voice thing, but because she felt that her character was too fragile and soft, and all she did was hang out and wait to be rescued. But then, reviews would be soft, and it was criticized pretty strongly and called empty. Audiences seemed to agree since it was a bomb, dead on arrival, only bringing in around $17 million and disappearing quickly, although it would then get a ton of play on cable. Over time, it would build an audience and develop a massive cult following, and recently the rights to do a remake were purchased by Warner Brothers, with J.J. Abrams directing, although no more word on that has been reported. And I love Krull, so I'm going with a 4. Sure, the effects are dated, and as a hero, Corwin's nothing without his supporting cast, but that supporting cast is gold, and the world it creates is really enjoyable. Its significance is a 3.5, and I wish I could give this higher, but let's face it was a big bust, and eventually made an impact, but certainly not when it was released, and it had no follow-ups to carry on its legacy. Should you watch it? Yep, and then pretend to throw around an imaginary glaive for an hour afterwards.
Wait! Wait for me! I've just remembered! I've urgent business in this direction.
What business?
Staying alive.
This episode begins sometime in July of 1983 with an unclear date, but sometime in July, and it's Space Raiders. It begins with some very familiar sounding music because it's lifted directly from Battle Beyond the Stars. And we're on a remote planet out in space at this little outpost. There's a group of pirates there led by Dr. Ben Casey, and they steal a ship, but a little kid stows aboard. If the ship looks very familiar, well, that's because it's also lifted straight out of Battle Beyond the Stars, and they reused the footage from there. One of the pirates is Luca Bercovici, who we last saw in Frightmare and Parasite, and this guy would later go on to be a director and producer, and is responsible for the OG Ghoulies. Peter helps them get out of a tight spot, and they're chased by a member of the company, a big bad evil corporation, and those words all mean the same thing. They plan to return the kid to his home planet, but first stop at a rest station and encounter a guy who likes this car, and an alien crime boss. They watch a hologram from Crazy Mel, and it's a little Dick Miller cameo, and they make a deal to steal 4 ships from the company and deliver them to Jared-Syn. First, they have to rescue Peter from a couple of bounty hunters, although that almost ends in disaster when the company blows them up, nearly killing the kid. They find him with the help of their psychic alien, Flight Plan, and this is Tom Christopher, the guy who plays Hawk in Buck Rogers, so he's used to head appliances. Although this one has ears that are rather yonic, and go ahead and look that one up. They then have to complete the mission, steal the ships, get the boy home, and escape the clutches of the company. And this one was riding high off of the still massive influence of Star Wars at this time, and was put out by Roger Corman's company, New World Pictures, and was the result of a new contract he was under after selling off the company. He promised to deliver at least 5 movies and do them cheaply, spending between $2 to $5 million on each. He hired Howard R. Cohen to write and direct, and he had previously handled Saturday the 14th for Corman, and to save money, they recycled all those ship shots and music from Battle Beyond the Stars, but also pulled some music cues from Humanoids from the Deep as well. What's funny is that the poster features this vaguely Enterprise-looking ship, which isn't in the movie, and this vaguely Chewbacca-looking character, who isn't in the movie. Critics tore it to shreds, discussing its dual rip-off nature of both knocking off Star Wars and then just repackaging older footage, and it soon slipped into the realm of obscurity, although it has a decent cult following. And this isn't great, but I've always just enjoyed it, so it's a 3 from me. I like space flicks that feel more like westerns, and this is clearly patterned off of something like Shane, and it's a decent time. Its sci-fi cultural significance is just a 2 though, since it's not all that well known outside of a cult appreciation, although it does have a handful of known faces and Corman's involvement. However, you have to credit some of its notoriety to Battle. Should you watch it? Sure, it's a kind of fun throwback flick that's nothing special, but still enjoyable.
Wanna have a good time, boys?
We're having a good time.
We're going ahead to August now, and on August 5th, we're headed into the animation world with Twice Upon a Time. We're told about a mystical city called Din, and people there are called the Rushers. But there's this villainous villain who wants to give the Rushers constant nightmares. And he's synonymous Botch. And he sends out these vultures with nightmare bombs? There's some mixtures with live action happening too, as they're delivered little sweet dreams, but the vultures counteract them. In the Dream Factory, there's a couple of lower level workers that are constantly getting into trouble. One of them is Ralph. He's a shape-shifting thing called an all-purpose animal, although he doesn't really seem to have much control of his abilities. His voice is pretty familiar since he's Peter Venkman, or is he Garfield? Or both? Yeah, he's both. His partner is Mumford, and he's a mime and is voiced by Marlon Brando. The boys decide that they want to help out with fighting the nightmares and team up with Flora Fauna, and they infiltrate the Merc Works and meet Botch's right-hand man, the jester Scuzzbopper. And you'll hear some interesting things as Botch occasionally tosses out some 4-letter words, and I'll get back to that in a minute. They're tricked and told that they need to go and retrieve the main spring from the cosmic clock, and along the way encounter a fairy godmother and a dumb superhero, and they all have to team up to stop the nightmares. And this was actually the first animated film that was produced by George Lucas and Lucasfilm. It was co-written and co-directed by a guy named John Cordy, who had been in the industry for a while, but not with animation. But he created a new process that he called loomage, which was essentially using little cutouts and placing them on big planes of glass and stacking them to give depth. He developed this concept as a way to show off this new technique, which was much cheaper than traditional cell animation and made a little demo reel to get investors. Lucas saw it and jumped on board, and they went forward with it, giving it a budget of a mere $3 million, very low for an animated feature. But then they went to work, and one of the members of the visual effects team was a 17-year-old David Fincher, and another was a young Henry Selick, director of The Nightmare Before Christmas and Coraline. Quite a bit of the dialogue was improvised, and there was a number of different takes on lines, which led to a really interesting problem. The film was created for kids, but when they did test screenings, they noticed older audience members leaving. So one of the producers, Bill Kachori, decided to wrangle up the actors and had them improv some dialogue with blue language with the hopes of keeping older crowds interested, and did this without Cordy's awareness. This is the version that ran at the premiere, and this is when the director found out about it. He was furious, but release prints had already been made and distributed, much to the shock of theaters who had already arranged it as a double bill for more G-rated fare, and it ended up getting pulled from screenings. It only got a limited release and bombed, only making $5 grand. It would get a cable run, but the version was the one with the swears, causing Cordy to threaten legal action and getting it banned from HBO. It's since gone on to a kind of small cult fame. And I've always liked this one, so it's a 3.5 from me. It doesn't make a ton of sense, but it's so visually interesting and fun. I guess I saw this in the cursey version, since I've always remembered it as the cartoon it swears. And I just get a kick out of it. Its SFCS is just a 2 though, since it had an impact behind the scenes, creating new styles of animation and had some budding stars working on it, but it's always been a very hidden treasure. Should you watch it? Yes, Lorenzo Music demands it.
I want nightmares! Read my lips! Nightmares! Asshole.
This next one had a dual debut in both America and Canada on August 12th, and it's The Man Who Wasn't There. Not to be confused with the Coen brothers film with that name, which I'm told is not a remake of this, which is probably a shame. A group of ambassadors are attending a function in Washington, and it's being taken care of by Officer Carrie Mahoney. And look for a really quick appearance by Ernie the Mortician. There's a big fight at the event, which causes problems for Sam, who's getting married later that day, and the manager of the Sedgwick Hotel is here. Sam tries to hustle to his wedding and runs headlong into the middle of a weird chase involving Yvel and George Sr., and his best friend is the Brood Dad. They get to the wedding, but as they're there, a bunch of thugs break in and start fighting with an invisible man and manage to kill him. Before he dies, though, he passes something to Sam, who is blamed for the killing. The thugs are working for another see-through fella, and Sam teams up with a friend named Cindy to reveal himself, and he checks out that orb. In it are little vials of liquid, which these two are very quick to open up and just start touching, so thank goodness it's not anthrax or some sort of bioplague, because zombie movies have started this same way. He turns invisible, but that gang shows up right away, and Sam and Cindy go to try to figure out what to do. So she takes him to hide out in a girls' school. To clarify, she takes an invisible naked man to an all-girls school and then just leaves him there. So, like, she has a ton of trust. First thing he does, though, is go into the showers. But then he reappears, so the effects are temporary, and he soon finds out that this whole thing goes way deeper than he expected. So this one was originally entitled The Man Who Wasn't There 3D, and it was from Paramount, who were very excited about the success of Friday the 13th Part 3 and wanted to do another one with things poking at the screen. They threw it together, hiring Bruce Malmuth as director since he had just done the hilarious laugh-a-minute Stallone flick Nighthawks. It was sort of a remake of North by Northwest, just with the invisibility stuff tossed in, and it was given a budget of $6.5 million. It was both a critical and financial failure, getting terrible reviews and only earning around $2.5 million at the box office, although it managed to nab a fair share of cable play. And this is a 2.5. It's not terrible, and it's pretty silly and fun, but it's also very surface level, and it's weird because the whole movie you're watching some guy cheat on his fiancée, so the movie has to go out of his way to justify that at the end, and it's kinda dumb. Its significance is just a 2 since it was a big bomb and not many people know about it, especially since it shares the title with a much bigger film, but it has enough known stars to rank it up a bit. Should you watch it? If you're a fan of Steve Guttenberg's butt, then absolutely, because that thing is all over this movie. We haven't had a Mad Max ripoff yet in this entire video, so let's fix that by going over to Italy for a film that debuted there on August 13th, and it's The Exterminators of the Year 3000. There's this police cruiser, and a robot voice tells them to return to base since they've been deactivated, although they ignore it. They encounter a maniac in a rigged-up car, and he takes them out and steals their water, but then his car's stolen. There's also this little outpost, and they had a man go out looking for water and never returned, so they send out a group to find him. But little Tommy stows aboard since that man was his father. So they're attacked by marauders, and you know, some of these Mad Max clones try to hide the fact, but not this one. Oh no, this one is just like, we're doing Mad Max and no one can stop us. They destroy the convoy and only Tommy escapes, and he saves our main guy, whose name is Alien, by the way. And he says his car is the best in the world and is called the Exterminator. The head of the gang is named Crazy Bull, and it turns out that Tommy isn't what he seems to be since his arm is detachable. In his quest to get the kid fixed, he encounters Papillon, an astronaut, and he's Luciano Pigozzi, who we last saw in Yore. They also come across Alien's old flame, Trash, and together they decide to find the secret water stash and bring it back for the colony, unless Alien can double-cross everyone first. And by the way, I should mention that Crazy Bull is constantly calling everyone mother grabbers or some variation of mother. It's like every other line of his. And I've mentioned this several times in other videos, but this was the era of non-stop Italian knockoffs of both Mad Max and Conan. This one was by Giuliano Carnameo, and it's the first that we're seeing him here on the project, but he'd been directing Italian schlock since the 60s. This would actually be one of his last couple of films, but we'll see him again over on the horror version of the project. Robert Iannucci, who played Alien, said in an interview that the film's writers and Carnameo didn't speak English too well, so the script didn't sound like actual dialogue, and the actors asked if they could adapt the lines to seem more natural, but were not allowed. On a DVD commentary, he also expressed confusion that anyone would have any interest in the film that barely released, and was relieved when informed the genre fans don't really think all that much of it. And they don't. It was very poorly received when it came out, and even contemporary ones are pretty lackluster. And I don't think it's that bad, so I'll give it a 2.5. It's never boring, and there's enough unintentional humor to keep me interested, but it's certainly nothing that we haven't seen a dozen times on the project so far. Its sci-fi cultural significance is just a 1 though, since it's one of the more obscure of the Max rips and doesn't really have any name recognition going for it. Should you watch it? You can give it a shot, you mother grabber.
Once more into the breach, you mother grabbers! All right, mother grabbers, come on! All right, make haste, you mother grabbers! Let's see what splitting the mother in two does to his ego. Alien, the Ides of March are upon you, you mother. To battle, my merry mother grabbers! Blow the mother grabber into bits and pieces!
Well, speaking of Italian Mad Max ripoffs, let's stay in that world, and in that country, for August 15th. And a movie that later got a US release in '85, and it's Escape from the Bronx. We see a government crew clearing out the Bronx and kicking people out, or just setting them on fire, I guess. But then they encounter someone familiar, and it's Trash, because this is actually a sequel to a film we've covered in the 82 episodes, 1990 The Bronx Warriors. The Bronx gangs are all congregating underground to keep fighting under a new leader named Doblon, but he discovers that his parents were killed. The GC Corporation's plan is to clear out the area and tear it down in order to build a new city of the future. The program is led up by Henry Silva, who we last saw in Megaforce, and his crew comes up against Trash and the gang, but mostly Trash. But then there's trouble when a reporter named Moon Gray finds out some crucial information and helps out the gangs, convincing them to try to kidnap the corporation's president. So they join up with a mercenary named Strike, played by the warrior of the Wasteland, and his son, and commence their plan. And like I've already said, this is the sequel to The Bronx Warriors, and features only a few of the same cast. It's once again directed by Enzo Castellari, and this is the fourth and final of his Mad Max knockoffs, although this one is more Snake than Max. Whereas the first Bronx flick was a mix between Road Warrior and Escape from New York, as you can tell from the title, this one is more of the latter. It was shot over a year after the first film, and in that time, Mark Gregory, who plays Trash, had lost a ton of weight, and he wasn't super buff in the first place, but now just looked like a beanpole. This disappointed Castellari, but he wanted to keep his lead actor, so he simply made him wear a thick leather jacket throughout the entirety of the film. Although it was meant to be set in New York, most of it was filmed in Rome, and that's pretty obvious in a large number of scenes. The reviews were mediocre at best, as it didn't get him all that much attention at the time, but combined with the other Castellari flicks, it's formed a little legacy of its own, and it was even riffed on for an episode of MST3K. And I'm giving this one a 3. I think I like it a little more than Bronx Warriors, but also a little less at times, if that makes any sense. Like, it's missing the anything goes feel that one someone had. but it has more of an actual plot, so it balances out. Its SFCS is a 2 since it's not all that well known, but has the mystery science nod, gains some cult notice, and gets mentioned as a ripoff pretty frequently. Should you watch it? Yeah, it's worth a watch since it's pretty fun stuff.
No sugar, you idiot! How many times do I have to tell you, no sugar? It makes me crazy!
On that very same day, August 15th, back in the US, there was a movie that is definitely not a Mad Max ripoff, probably not a Star Wars rip, but I guess we'll see, with Prisoners of the Lost Universe. It starts with Kay Lenz, an actress I used to have a crush on because of Stripped to Kill, and I just found out right now that she was the voice of American Maid on the Tick cartoon. She's a TV reporter in Los Angeles, and while driving gets into a wreck with Captain Apollo, and then goes to meet up with a wacky professor to cover a new invention that he claims to have come up with. He says that he has a machine that can transport things to another dimension and tests it out for her, just as a large earthquake hits, and after Dan shows up there, all 3 of them end up falling in. They wind up in a large forest, separated, and Carrie is forced to go looking for them, and pretty soon it's clear that things aren't what they seem. She encounters a caveman in quicksand, and then a feral tribe with glowing eyes, and meets back up with Dan. They also meet up with a gray-faced man who tells them that the world is called Vanya, but they discover that time works differently there since Dan fell in before Carrie, but only about 30 seconds, and he arrived a week earlier. But then things get tricky when Carrie is kidnapped by Nancy's dad, so Dan has to pair up with a man named Malachi to get her back. So this one was co-written and directed by Terry Marcel, who was the director of a previous sword and sorcery flick called Hawk the Slayer from 1980. Most of the filming was done in South Africa, and the production company was from the UK, but it would end up getting a cable debut in the US before getting a theatrical run in some other countries. There's a bit of a mix-up with its copyright status, but it appears as if it was thought to be in public domain for a while and had a number of low-end releases of dubious quality. But Wikipedia states that the copyright is indeed active and registered, so if you had your release of this all ready to go, you might want to hold up on that. And I wanted to enjoy this one, but honestly it's mostly dull, so I'll give it a 2. It has all the right ingredients, but never bothers to actually cook them, and most of the runtime feels like padding. Its SFCS is the same since it's not much known, but it does have a good amount of faces you'll recognize and a bit of notoriety. Should you watch it? I'd say no, but it has Kay Lenz in it, so maybe yes anyway.
Yeah. What about me?
What about you, Bimbo?
Just one day later, on August 16th, there was a limited release for a film that debuted in Chicago, Dallas, and Minneapolis, and it's Wavelength. Lewis is here, and he's a musician, and they say he's 27, and at the time Robert Carradine was 26, which is pretty funny considering 1 year later, he'd be playing a college freshman in Revenge of the Nerds. He meets up with some runaway, and they start dating, and Iris starts hearing this sad sound coming from a complex near Bobby's place. They start to check the place out, and whoops, boom mic. They find an old air shaft that leads into the place, and they go in. Turns out that there's a squad of scientists down there doing some sort of dissection, and then Bobby and Iris are caught. Turns out that they have 3 things in these tubes here, and Iris is able to communicate with them. And it turns out that they recovered the aliens from a crashed ship, and realize that they're starting to wake up. They realize that Iris is able to hear them because she's a twin. But things start to escalate when people start to die, so the agency just decides to fill up the facility with our pair still in it. So they decide to free the aliens and get out. All the while, this alarm keeps going off that makes me think that the aliens are weird and pissed off.
What difference does it make? Get the boy.
This one was both written and directed by Mike Gray, and he was actually nominated for an Oscar back in 1980 for The China Syndrome, which he wrote. On various projects, he also served as a producer and even a cinematographer, but only directed 3 times. He did a documentary back in 1969, 3 episodes of the Starman TV show, and then this movie, which is kind of like Starman, actually. It seems that this script had been in Gray's repertoire for a while, and no one wanted to fund it. It eventually came close at one point, but since it was too similar to Close Encounters, they didn't go through with it. Eventually, though, it secured a very meager $1.5 million budget and was made independently. It ended up getting a very limited theatrical run, but then showed up on cable, where it got a fair amount of play. Oh, and hey, remember earlier when I said that this is similar to Starman? Well, when the alien ship appears next to the end, it's exactly the same. I tried to find a story on this, but outside of people saying Starman ripped it off, I couldn't find any indication of whether or not this was intentional. But the fact that Gray did a bunch of work on the Starman TV show makes me think that it was with permission. And I'm giving this one a 3.5. I've always liked this one since seeing it way back in the day on cable, and it holds up. It's not the fastest paced moving, and no one would accuse it of being action-packed, but it's got a nice vibe, cool score, and I dig it. Its significance is only a 2, though, since it's not well known and has sort of slipped into obscurity, but it has enough people involved that it gets an extra tidbit. Should you watch it? Yeah, put it on your Wavelength. A few days later, on August 19th, we get one that's taken on its own form of infamy, and it's Metalstorm, the destruction of Jared-Syn. And boy, I can't wait to see how it storms metal, and I really can't wait to see this Jared guy get destroyed. Both of those things are going to happen, right? It's yet another one of those Mad Max clones, as you can tell from the fact that we're in a post-apocalyptic wasteland, and there's modified cars and bald guys with ponytails. We meet our hero, Dogen, and he's chased by one of the most hilariously matted-in ships of all time. But then, we also meet a couple of miners, and one is the late Kelly Preston, but her and her dad are attacked by these guys. And hey, you're pointing that thing right at me, can you move that away? Well, Pops gets sprayed and then sees this guy, Jared-Syn, and those Mad Max ripoffs aren't going anywhere, since this is Michael Preston, who played Papa Giallo in The Road Warrior. They kill the guy, and Dogen finds the remains and meets up with Diana and tells her that he's hunting Sin and his son, Baal. They find a crystal that was left behind and take it to get examined, and learn that it's a storage device for life force, and the only defense against it is some sort of magic mask. So they go off in search of it, poking as many things at the camera as they can, and coming across both Jack Death and Bull. And that's because this is another one that's popped up in this little 3D boom of the era, and it's another one from Charles Band, future Full Moon Entertainment creator. It was given a modest budget of $3.5 million and was meant to evoke the feelings of a futuristic western. It was even given the tagline, "It's high noon at the end of the universe," which Band would then later reuse for a Full Moon movie, Oblivion 2. Night Court fans can actually credit this movie for Bull's look, because Richard Mole shaved his head for this film and had that look when he auditioned for the show. They liked it so much that he continued the shave style for the character, becoming his standard look. It actually did get a theatrical run, and the reviews basically knocked it for being extremely derivative, feeling like a hybrid between Mad Max and Star Wars, with little originality of its own. It was a little profitable though, since it drew in $5.3 million, although once marketing and margins are tossed in there, it likely didn't make any money. And I get a kick out of this, so it's a 3.5 for me. I know it's not good, and it's doing a lot of the same stuff a million other Mad Max ripoffs are, but it's keeping things entertaining with fun chases, and Thomerson having a good time, and I'm a sucker for it. Its SFCS is a 3, since it did get a good amount of attention on cable back in the day, running all the time, and has since gotten a lot of cult cred, but it's not really a mainstream success. Should you watch it? Yes! Just don't expect that storm of metal or anything.
The two of you took this.
He took it.
Then he lives. You do not.
1 week later, on August 26th, we have one that did get a screening a little earlier in the year in other countries, but it came out here on the 26th, and it's Fire and Ice. A text screen tells of a queen named Juliana who had a son named Necron, and the two of them took over the realm of ice and drove the humans out. But there's an opposition in the realm of Firekeep called Gerald, and the two sides are at war. It's animated and has that smooth motion where they move, and I'll talk about that stuff later. And we meet our hero, Iron, who narrowly escapes being killed along with the rest of his village. Meanwhile, Gerald has a daughter named Tigra, whose whole thing appears to be lounging around in a sexy manner, and she's kidnapped by Necron's men. And then she takes a bath, and then crawls around, and holy crap, this is the horniest cartoon. Tigra and Iron meet up and hang out, with the princess just sort of pointing her butt at him non-stop.
It's getting colder.
Then put on some clothes! Damn it, you're literally wearing strings. After getting separated, Iron then has to team up with a masked man named Dark Wolf to try to save the girl and the kingdoms. Well, this one was another animated work from Ralph Bakshi, a man rather notorious by this point for doing adult-oriented cartoons. He actually worked quite a bit on that Spider-Man animated series from the late 60s and early 70s, and his episodes are particularly bizarre. But then, in '72, he made Fritz the Cat, a wild X-rated cartoon that he paired with legendary cartoonist Robert Crumb to make. He also did the animated Lord of the Rings from '78, one of the first adaptations of the story. This movie was a collab between Bakshi and an amazing artist, Frank Frazetta, who designed the look of the characters and world. It was written by a pair of names that'll sound super familiar if you're a comic book fan, since the script was by Roy Thomas and Jerry Conway on the strength of their Conan books from Marvel. It uses Bakshi's favorite technique of rotoscoping, and let me explain that. They would actually film live-action actors doing the motions that they wanted, and then they would take the film, and an animator would then essentially trace each frame of film, and then added details and such. Basically, you're just matching the actions as happen, so the animated segments then look like live motion. In case you were curious, that means that yes, an actual live actress had to do all those silly poses for Tigra, and they used actress Cynthia Leek. They actually got this done on a fairly low budget of only $1.2 million, gotten middling to poor reviews that weren't really that impressed with the film. It also was a bust at the theater, earning less than $1 million. It did earn a good cable following, though, and over time has developed a cult audience, and at one point, Robert Rodriguez was interested in doing a remake of it in live action. There was also a prequel comic book released in 2023 from Dynamite Entertainment, who also gave us a spin-off series for Tigra. And this is a 3. It's kind of terrible, but I also can't hate it. Like, sure, it's repetitive as hell. It's just, Tigra gets kidnapped, Tigra gets saved, repeat. But it looks great, and it's silly fun. Its significance is at 2.5, since it's actually one of Bakshi's medium-known films with a cult following, but no mainstream one, but did get a fair amount of attention back in the day. Should you watch it? Sure, particularly if you're a fan of cartoon butts. There's a bunch of that. On that very same day, we're going to close out this block on a big note, and by big I mean muscles, since we're talking about Hercules. It begins with telling us about the entire creation of the universe, so it's like really giving us an origin story. We're introduced to the gods, and Zeus wants to try to help the forces of good against evil, and Athena suggests that he give one man a great strength to try to even things up, so he creates Hercules. And he's pretty hulkish, and allows him to be born on Earth. But then, a sacred sword is stolen. But was all a plan to betray the king that was plotted by Ariadne, who's some sort of werewolf bitch, and they try to kill little Hercs, but his mother manages to send him off as they kill her. Baby Herc has to fight evil eels, which is hilarious, and he's taken in by a kindly couple. He grows up to become massive and also dubbed, and I'll talk about that, and he even has to fight a bear that magically changes colors from shot to shot. But I should explain, he doesn't just fight the bear. No, he straight up throws it into space, where it becomes the Ursa constellation. Turns out that Hera is jealous and wants him destroyed and unleashes this awesome robo-bird that kills his mom. So he heads out to find his fortune, competing in gladiatorial games. Just like in the myths, he's given impossible tasks to complete, but then when his love Cassiopeia is taken away by Adriana, he has to team up with the witch Circe to rescue her and stop them. So here's what's up with this one. This was by Luigi Cozzi, and we've already covered him a couple of times. Once on the Horror Project with Contamination, and once here on the Sci-Fi Project with Escape from Galaxy 3. This was given a budget of $6 million and was shot back-to-back with the 7 Magnificent Gladiators in Italy, but Ferrigno wasn't happy about the script. Seems after reading it, he stormed into the producer's office and threw it in the trash because he objected to all the violence and sex, as he was told it would be a more family-friendly fantasy film. Even though Menahem Golan, that producer, wanted a more R-rated version, they ended up softening the film to get it a PG. The star bulked up more than usual for the role, saying it was the best condition he'd ever been in, a point that wasn't lost on Sybil Danning, who had a big crush on him. However, he was married and showed no interest, and it seems like they sparred a bit on set since she claims that she was originally the love interest, but since Ferrigno didn't like working with her on Gladiators, had her switched to the villain of the piece. Because of this, she'd speak pretty negatively on the promotional tour. Speaking of speaking, Ferrigno's voice, like most roles he did, was overdubbed by another actor. He's mostly deaf and has a speech impediment because of it, so he'd frequently have another actor go over his parts. This was actually a nice performance at the box office, earning around $11 million in ticket sales, which amounts to some profit, and it would go on to have a sequel 1 year later with The Adventures of Hercules. And I'm giving this a 2.5. There's parts I love, but then there's long gaps of dull, and I wish it was able to maintain its zaniness through the whole thing. Its significance is a 2.5 since it was pretty notable at the time, did well enough to get a sequel, and has a handful of known faces. Should you watch it? Probably. There's enough good stuff here even if it's spaced out. This block begins on the small screen as we go on now to September 1st with a TV movie entitled Anna to the Infinite Power. It has this young girl named Anna Hart, and she goes to a school for gifted children, and her teacher should probably teach a class on urban legends or something. Seems that they're having trouble with Anna since she's a bit of a kleptomaniac, and she keeps having these weird dreams about a woman she calls Mother. Her brother is some sort of scream queen, and she sees another girl on the TV named Anna that looks exactly like she does. She enlists her brother to help her figure out who this Anna Smithson is, but when they go to find her, her mother says she doesn't have a daughter named Anna. Her mother decides to tell her the truth and tells her that there was a brilliant scientist named Anna Zimmerman, and right before she came through on a massively innovative discovery, she died. So they chose to try an experiment and clone her, making several genetic reproductions, and little Anna Hart is one of them. This news shocks her and she has an identity crisis, but then can't find any information about any Anna Zimmerman. But then the mysterious Michaela shows up with an interest in the girl, but the pair butt heads immediately. And Donna Mitchell kind of looks like Debbie Harry? Or is that just me? But her lessons with Michaela soon become very antagonistic, and things really ramp up when she discovers Zimmerman was a prisoner in a concentration camp, forced to be a part of their plan to create a master race. And like I said, this one was a TV movie, and it was directed by Robert Weimer, and was his first feature-length work. He had previously done a short and a TV episode and was a writer, but this was his first turn at directing features. He'd shift back into TV shortly after this, though, and handled a number of Star Trek episodes. It was based on a novel from 1981 with the same name by Mildred Ames, and the film was made with the intention of a theatrical release but ended up being sold to HBO instead and aired there as a premiere. The reviews were mostly negative, with most calling the film flat and very sitcom feeling, and it somewhat quickly faded into the background. And I like this, so I'll give it a 3 out of 5 tapes. It's probably done a little too sitcom-y to truly work, but it's got some cool ideas and concepts, even if it doesn't really flesh them out as much as you want them to. Its sci-fi cultural significance is at 1.5 since it's fairly unknown and didn't really impact the genre overall, but it's got some names involved with it to make it stand out a touch. Should you watch it? I'd say yeah. Maybe not to the infinite power, but at least to the third power?
Anna, you've changed.
See? No more headaches.
Just one day later, on September 3rd, we're going back to the big screen for this one, called Striker. As soon as the movie starts, we see a nuclear detonation and a desert background, so you could probably guess that it's going to be a Road Warrior clone. And they mention that water is low in supply, and whoever controls it controls the world, so yeah, it is. There's a woman on the run being chased by a group of marauders, but she's saved by 2 guys. The main guy is our title hero, Striker, and his sidekick is named Bandit. And oh look, it's Buddy Repperton. And here's a fun factoid. In the last episode, I covered Fire and Ice, the animated film that came out in '83. And Steve Sandor, who plays Striker, and William Ostrander, who plays Bandit, voiced main characters in that film and are paired up again here in the flesh. Dila gets captured though and taken back to the warlord Cardis, who wants to torture her to find out where her colony is, since he knows they have water. If you're not convinced that they were trying to do the Road Warrior thing, well, here's a chase scene featuring a big tanker trucker with people fighting on top of it. The guys have to go in and save Dela again and return her to our people, and he makes the discovery that they've been trying to enlist the help of his lost brother to help them, but it seems that he's been captured by Cardis as well, and geez, he was just there. Like, now he's got to go back and save someone else? I guess a hero's job is never done. And this is probably one of the more blatant of the Mad Max ripoffs, and it's by low-budget schlock director Cirio Santiago, and it's the first that we're encountering him on the project, but it certainly won't be the last. It won't even be the last Mad Max rip that we'll see him do. In fact, this seems to have given him a post-apocalyptic bug, since it would be the focus of several of his later films. And in fact, his final film, which was released posthumously and he only worked a couple of days on it, was a remake of this one called Water Wars. The reviews for this one weren't kind at all, and most critiqued the fact that it was just a thinly veiled clone. It did get a really limited release though, but didn't really leave much of an impact. And I'm just going to give this one a 2. It's got a smattering of entertaining scenes, but it all feels a little been there, done that, especially after seeing about 5 or 6 other films just like it in this same time frame. Its sci-fi cultural significance is just a 1.5 since it's not all that well known, even in terms of Max ripoffs, but it gets talked about occasionally and had Santiago directing. Should you watch it? Not really. I mean, it's fine and all, but it's just so generic. Speaking of ripoffs, let's jump to September now, and this one debuted in limited release on September 2nd, but went wider on September 16th, and it's Deathstalker. It begins with a couple being attacked by some sort of troll-looking guys, but they're saved by a sword-slinging blonde guy who kills them all. But it turns out that the girl is the man's captive, and he's not that happy about that either, and sets her free by stabbing the dude. But don't think he's too heroic, because he then gropes the woman. He's known as the Deathstalker, and he then meets up with a witch woman who wants him to help her find this set of relics, a chalice, an amulet, and a sword, and reunite them. Unfortunately, a couple of them are said to be in the hands of Munkar, an evil sorcerer. He heads out to find the first item, a sword, and has to fight a big monster to get it, and is aided by a ghouly-looking imp. He helps him leave the cave, where it turns out that he's actually a human that was cursed, and agrees to aid the stalker in his journey. He also helps out another guy that joins the group, and you might not be able to tell because he's certainly not a bulky gent, but this is Richard Brooker, most known for playing Jason Voorhees in Friday the 13th Part 2. There's one final member of their group, a warrior woman named Kyra, and she's played by Lana Clarkson. And this was pretty early in her career and her biggest role to date, and I'll talk more about her later. The four then set out to reunite the three powers and end the reign of Munkar, but before they do it, it's very important that they stop and check out some mud wrestling. And if you're a fan of the horror flick X-Ray, you'll be pleased to see that film's Barbie Benton appearing here, and you'll be glad to know that she's not clothed for about 75% of her screen time. And this one is credited to John Watson as the director of the film, but that was a pseudonym for James Spartalotti. Spartalotti, and it was only one of 2 films that he'd direct. The only other one from him was a 1987 action comedy called Under the Gun with Sam Jones in the lead role. He does have a number of other credits though, and has a really long list of titles as an assistant director, including the crazy Island of Dr. Moreau that has all the stories behind it with Brando. But this one was yet another in that big wave of Conan knockoffs when every low-budget company was putting out films about massive shirtless barbarian fellows. It was from Roger Corman's New World Pictures, but it was in conjunction with Argentina, and was the first of a number of flicks that he did there. This one was actually a bit of a surprise hit in theaters and pulled in around $5 million, and then did extremely well on the home market with VHS rentals, and then cable airings. Because of this, they decided to make more, with the first being Barbarian Queen, a kind of spin-off with Clarkson essentially playing the same character as she does here, but she's also different. It's just weird because it's referred to as a spin-off of this, but doesn't really seem to have any actual connections, so it likely just is meant to take place in the same universe. There were also several sequels, with Deathstalker 2, 3, and 4 releasing in later years. There's also an upcoming remake coming from Steven Kostanski, director of Psycho Goreman, and is slated to be released in either late 25 or early 26. And I'll give it a 3. I like Deathstalker, but I can also admit that it's just not really all that good. It's not doing much of anything that any of the imitators weren't doing, but it's got a certain charm that I appreciate and a level of horniness that the other films just couldn't match. Its significance is a 3 as well, since it did get more known and was successful enough to launch a series, but it never reached that higher level of success it could have, and never stepped out of Conan's shadow. Should you watch it? I would say yes, give it a stalking.
Oh my God!
We're headed back to Italy again for this next one, which came out over there on September 21st, and take a peek at Hearts and Armor. We're in a medieval world and hear about a guy named Ruggero, and a young woman is attacked by a group of dudes, but she's rescued by a man on horseback. He makes short work of the group, but surprise, surprise, there's no one in the armor. There's then this Christian knight who makes his way into a little village, and there's a whole group of them, with each one having a different detail on top of their helmets. This one is Orlando, and he's returning from a journey. Meanwhile, Sheena is here too, and also attacked in that same river, but is rescued by Bradamante, who is now wearing that armor that saved her. Not enough characters? Well, then there's Marfisa here, and she approaches Ruggero, and he's Ron Moss, who we all remember as Rowdy Abilene from the all-time classic Hard Ticket to Hawaii, and this is his first film. The only thing that he was in before this was a music video in the late 70s. He fights a group of the knights and kills some of them, but they have to have an official challenge since his sister Angelica is with them. And he's set to fight Orlando, but Bradamante wants to fight instead? And I feel like I'm making this sound somewhat linear, but it's all so confusing, and I'm not exactly sure who the hell is who here. But Lando is in love with Angie, it seems, and I think I should point out that Ruggero and Angelica are supposed to be Moors, which doesn't seem quite right. It's then a tale of love triangles, star-crossed love, and lots of battles, as well as invisibility emeralds. And even though this is Italian, it's hard to call this another ripoff, unless you want to say that it's biting Conan, but it's really not. I suppose you could call it a rip of Excalibur, although that was a while back and wasn't a hit. This one was by Giacomo Battiato, and this was his first bigger project, and he'd done some Italian TV before this, but would never really go on to do any films of major note. It's said to be partially based on the classic tale Orlando Furioso, but also the stories of the Paladins, the Knights of Charlemagne's court. It's said that this is a shortened version, and then a longer version ran on Italian television as a mini-series, which might account for the seemingly fractured narrative, but I couldn't find any information of that version existing. Some people in the reviews seem to have located it or watched it, but I couldn't find it or even find out exactly how much longer that it was. And this is interesting. I'll give it a 3. There's no story, and it's just a series of events that may have been more fleshed out in the series, but here it's just disjointed, but it just looks so damn good and has this whole vibe that's cool to watch. Its significance is just a 1.5 though, since it's practically completely unknown, but it does have a handful of recognizable names involved. Should you watch it? I think so. There may not actually be a ton of heart, but there is a lot of cool armor. A little over a week later, on September 30th, in both the US and Canada, we're back in more traditional sci-fi land with the release of Brainstorm. We're in a computer lab where they're running a complex test, and Nurse Ratched is here, as is that guy who does all the dancing in hotel lobbies. Their gizmo lets you strap into it, and when another person is attached, you can experience what they're experiencing, all 5 senses. Michael is married to a girl named Maria, but they're separated, and their kid is baby Chris Romero. The project is being overseen by Uncle Ben, who wants them to demonstrate their device before it's ready, giving them a revolutionary new chip to make it work. The test is successful, and they're able to let their investors test it out, giving them a number of different experiences, like riding a roller coaster. And wait, a truck running off the road? So was someone strapped into a device there? Did they die? What happened to that person, and why is no one freaked out by it? But then things get interesting when the government gets involved and tampers with one of the feeds of having sex. And then Michael sees through Karen's eyes and experiences her emotions from their split, which is a shock as they weren't aware that they could record emotion. They're able to use this to share their times with each other, which leads to them reconciling. But there's another side to things, because that bit that was spliced out, this guy kept in order to just orgasm constantly. Everything changes when Lillian is working late and suffers a heart attack, but she manages to record her final instances on the machine, which kicks off the crew's concerns with finding out the truth about what happened to her, and their invention being co-opted by the military for something called Project Brainstorm. This one was directed by Douglas Trumbull, and he was mostly a visual effects guy and a producer later on, and only directed 2 feature films, this one and the 70s classic Silent Running. It was a bit notorious because in the middle of filming, Natalie Wood died under mysterious circumstances. She was on a weekend boating trip with several people, including Christopher Walken, and they went to Catalina Island off the coast of California, and she drowned. But she wasn't on the boat. She disappeared, and her body was found the next morning a mile away from the boat, with a small inflatable raft nearby. It was determined that she had an argument with her husband that night and drunkenly boarded the raft to go to the island herself and accidentally drowned, but her sister said that she couldn't swim, was terrified of water, and wouldn't have gotten on the boat herself. The actual details of what happened will likely never be known. But they had already finished filming all of her big scenes in the film with only some minor shots remaining. However, MGM felt that the production was troubled and decided to shut the whole thing down, and Trumbull had to seek out private investors and another studio. Then, when it appeared as if other studios were eager to have it to capitalize on Woods' death, MGM changed their mind and went forward with it, using Woods' younger sister, Lana, to shoot those last little bits. The release was stunted though, and only given a limited run and a small amount of promotion. On a budget of $18 million, it only brought in $10 million on release, and the aftermath prompted Trumbull to give up on directing studio features. And I'm giving this one a 3. I love what it's setting up in the first half, but then it just wants to be a movie about government stealing the idea instead of the ramifications of it, and I lost a good amount of interest. Its SFCS is a 2.5 since it wasn't a hit and never built up that big cult following, but it had some big names involved and is well known for being the final film for Wood. Should you watch it? I'd say yes, it's worth a peek to stimulate that brain. Alright, let's begin our little nuclear journey here, because on November 4th, in both New York and Los Angeles, there were limited screenings of a film called Testament. But don't expect any thrash metal, since the legacy of this film is more about nuclear war. This was the start of a new order of this kind of film, and it gives us the Weatherly family. With this guy who you recognize from 1,000 TV shows but don't know the name of, and it's William Devane. His wife is Jane Alexander, and everything I said about the 1,000 TV shows qualifies for her as well. They have 3 kids, and one should stay out of airplane cockpits, and another is a witness. Tom wants his kid to be healthy, and he makes sure to practice what he preaches, and they live a standard suburban life. One day, things get nuts when a news report states that some souls of black have detonated nuclear devices all along the East Coast. Everyone then conducts the ritual of heading out to find their neighbors and encounter a cradle-rocking hand and a wolf dancer. With their dad missing and no power, the family starts feeling low, and they all meet up in a church in case what's going on is demonic, but discuss how they're going to survive in the gathering. When discussing the attacks, a doctor tells them that the first strike is still deadly due to the radiation and fallout, and things start to get worse as the town gets more and more desperate, and we witness the formation of damnation for these people. But then, as the radioactivity starts to claim more and more people, and as it's seeped into the dark roots of the earth, and things are looking bleaker and bleaker. And this is by Lynn Littman. And before this, she had won an Oscar for directing a documentary short film called Number Our Days in 1976. This was based on a short story called The Last Testament by Carol Amon, and PBS bought the rights and made the film with the intentions of having it be a part of their American Playhouse series. However, Paramount executives who were involved in the production thought it deserved a theatrical release and decided to give it a full run. Because of this, the cast had to sue the producers, as their contract and pay rate were predicated on it being a TV movie, and then they wouldn't alter their rates after they changed it. The case never made it to court though, as the two parties settled. The reviews were strong, and it was very acclaimed, getting both a Golden Globe and Oscar nomination for Jane Alexander's performance. It then went on to have a big impact on the sci-fi world, giving a different and far more grounded view of what happens in the nuclear aftermath, a sharp contrast to all of the action-packed post-apocalyptic films coming out at the time. One person who didn't have a high opinion of it, though, was Carol Amon, the story's writer. A friend of hers said that they went to see the film together at a church screening, and she wasn't too excited about it, as it wasn't anything like what she expected. And yeah, what a banger. It's a 4. A sad, dark, depressing banger. Don't watch this if you're not ready to be in the worst mood afterwards. Its SFCS is a 3, since it did get a bunch of acclaim at the time. and had a fair amount of influence, but never really took off into that more mainstream level of notice that some of its contemporaries did. Should you watch it? Yeah, don't be a part of the Brotherhood of the Snake. One day later, on November 5th, in Italy, we have hopefully a little more lighthearted view of a post-nuclear aftermath with Endgame, Bronx Lotta Finale. It says that it's May 10th, 2025, which at the time that this video is going to be up will be about 2 months in the future. So I guess this is what we have to look forward to. It's after a nuke war and everything is irradiated, but there's still survivors roaming around. But masked soldiers are looking for those that they call mutants and shooting them on sights. Everyone watches this game called Endgame, basically gladiatorial combat, and their biggest star is Ron Shannon, played by Italian staple Al Cliver. He's going to be hunted down by a number of hunters, including other familiar faces like George Eastman and everyone's favorite badass pimp, Tony. Along the way, he helps out a lovely woman, and she's Laura Gemser, who we last saw over on the horror version of the project in Women's Prison Massacre, and he gets into a brawl with the Hunters, narrowly escaping with her help. He has the opportunity to take out Karnak, his biggest rival, but doesn't do so and is declared the winner of the match. After the game is over, Ron is recruited by Lilith to help her and the mutants get out of the city to safety, and if he does, they can supply him with a huge reward. The city officials find out about it and send Karnak to track him and stop him, but he's building up a team including some former opponents and criminals. Along the way, they come across some of the other mutations and see that they're regressing to ape and marine forms, and encounter danger along the way to freedom. I feel like I don't even have to say this anymore, but this is another Mad Max ripoff from Italy, with this one also tossing in some Escape from New York as well. It was by Joe D'Amato, and this is now his 8th film on the project between the horror and sci-fi, and his second sci-fi flick of the year. Earlier in '83, he did 2020 Texas Gladiators, or at least co-directed it with Eastman. Oddly, the beginning shows signs of originality with the Running Man style concept several years before the Running Man would be a film, but after the Prize of Peril, which had a similar concept of hunters chasing down a man. However, Endgame is a plot point in the opening of the film, and then it becomes a more standard we have to get out of the city storyline in the wasteland. Even though it wasn't that successful, it did okay, and one person liked it more than others, and that was D'Amato himself, who considered it one of his best films. And this is fine, it's a 2.5. It throws a lot of different elements into the mix, but it just never does all that much with them and feels a touch stale. The SFCS is a 2 since it did get some attention, a little more than some of the other Max rips, but it's still lesser known. Should you watch it? Perhaps. It's fun at times and has some good action bits, but even though it never really rises above. This next one is gonna feel really familiar because on November 20th, there was the TV movie The Day After. It introduces us to a doctor, and he's the head of the A-Team, which, yeah, I know it's Robards and not Papard, but I've had a long-running thing where I used to confuse the two of them all the time, so indulge me. Dr. Oakes' daughter is planning on moving away, and everyone's going to a wedding rehearsal, but there's a nearby missile silo where everything seems to be running like normal, even if they have an uneasy relationship with the locals. Tensions between the US and Russia are high, and they're on the brink of war, but everyone seems to think that no one is crazy enough to do it. They all just try to keep going on with their daily stuff, but can't stop talking about it, and Mrs. Freeling is on hand here, but so is Mahoney, Teen Clark Kent, Flounder, and the Trinity Killer. Things keep escalating, and the moment finally comes where they launch the missiles and the whole town sees them go up. The expected response comes back and nuclear bombs are dropped nearby, causing massive destruction and vaporizing everyone, including a woman and a baby and a class of little kids. The survivors all huddle up in shelters and have to figure out how to survive as the radiation levels increase. And it's wild that this is released so close to Testament because they're really similar films in their intent. but are just executed so vastly differently. It's also wild that that one was made to be a TV movie but then went theatrical, and this was a TV movie the whole time and aired on ABC as a big event. It was inspired by the film The China Syndrome, and the project began back in 1981, but took a good amount of time to make it through the development process. It was directed by Nicholas Meyer, who had just come off of doing Star Trek II, and he was skeptical about doing the project for TV since he didn't feel it would allow the depiction of the violence and death that would occur. It was his suggestion that they pare the film down, as they had originally intended to have it be a miniseries spread out over 2 nights and running 3 hours long, 4 with commercials. But Meyer convinced them that the script was too padded and bloated and suggested trimming it down to do in 1 night. The network disagreed and had him film the whole thing, but then had trouble finding advertisers because of the content, so they broke down and let him cut it down for 1 night. But even then, there were murmurs that they wanted to kill the broadcast, and it said that even Ronald Reagan put in a call to shelve it. But then, a bootleg copy of the film leaked to a number of anti-nuclear activists, and they sent it out to a number of peace groups and had screenings, and public discussion groups, and even got it out to the media. And the movement was called the Day Before Project, which created a huge buzz around the film. It became a massive hit, and it said that more than 100 million people watched the initial broadcast, and is stated to be one of the highest rated TV movies of all time. The media coverage was huge, and the political fallout was too, with Meyer being branded a traitor for promoting nuclear disarmament, saying that he was doing the Russians' work for them. But Reagan actually wrote that the film left him completely depressed, and he even altered his policy based on it. And there was a story that he sent a telegram to Meyer telling him that his film was responsible. Meyer, however, says that that's untrue. It won 2 Emmys and was nominated for a whole lot more, and has left a big impact on the genre. And this is also a 4. Fun fact, I watched this when it first aired, and it may have scarred me. Ultimately, if I were ranking them, Testament is a better take than this one, but they're both so damn good and bleak and compelling. Its significance is also a 4 since it was a huge sensation and literally changed policy, but I'm not sure that its impact has stood the test of time as opposed to being important at a specific point in time. Should you watch it? Yes, watch it the day during. So, today. Here's another one that's a little different than the standard stuff that's on here. Another TV movie that aired on November 23rd, and it's Doctor Who, The 5 Doctors. It begins with that familiar opening theme song, and then we have this guy, the Doctor. And if you've never watched the show, this man is an alien called a Time Lord who travels through time and space in a machine called the TARDIS. When he dies, his body will regenerate into a new form, allowing for a different actor to take on the role. And this guy, Peter Davison, is the 5th man to play him. He's traveling around with a young woman named Tegan, and they land on an Earth-like planet. But then there's this guy here, and this is Richard Hurndall, and he's the first Doctor, although he kind of isn't, and I'll discuss that in a bit. That guy's rounded up by some unseen force, and then we have the Brigadier Stewart, a popular character from earlier in the show. Patrick Troughton is here, and he was the 2nd Doctor, and he and Stewart are scooped up as well, but then there's John Pertwee, the 3rd Doctor, who gets that treatment too. We then have Sarah Jane Smith, one of the Doctor's most famous companions, along with the robot dog, K9. Finally, Tom Baker shows up as the 4th Doctor, the most well-known version at this time, and when the Mystery Man tries to capture him, something goes wrong and he's stuck in time instead, so Sarah Jane is taken. When his fellow Time Lords discover the time scoops, they call in the Doctor's greatest nemesis, the Master, to go and rescue him. There's even Daleks and Cybermen involved, so it's sort of a greatest hits of Doctor Who. And it was. The reason why I'm including this and none of the other Doctor stuff is that this was a special film to celebrate the character's 20th anniversary. They had previously done a crossover event called the Three Doctors that included the first three Doctors, and this was the first to feature all 5 versions of the characters together. Except, well, it didn't. William Hartnell, who had originally played the first Doctor, had passed away back in 1975, so Herndl was brought in to play the role. Also, Baker decided that he didn't want to take part, so they had to lock his character in time, and the footage that includes him is actually footage from an unfinished serial. When promoting the special, it said that Baker did agree to show up for a promotional photo shoot to promote the special, but then didn't show up. So they substituted a wax figure from Madame Tussauds. It was a good size success, even though it wasn't critically beloved and was called more of a love letter to the franchise than an actual story. It would also be the final time that there was a crossover episode that featured more than 2 versions of the character, all the way until 2013, the show's 50th anniversary. And this is a 3.5. And here's a little talked about thing on this channel. I'm a long-time Doctor Who fan. I grew up on the Baker version, and I've always had a soft spot for the show. And this movie's fun, even if it's a little bit all over the place, and I imagine just wouldn't hit for non-fans. Its significance is a 3.5 as well, since it's one of the more well-known Who episodes, but let's face it, the Doctor never had that sort of relevance over here until its resurgence, and even then it was still like a cult thing. Should you watch it? If you're a Who fan, definitely. If you're not, I'd say no, as this might be a little too full of inside stuff to get into.
Tegan. Sarah.
Almost at the end of the year here, and we're staying overseas because in Italy, on November 25th, we had the Raiders of Atlantis, or Atlantis Interceptors. It starts in the far-off future of 1994 and has a couple of guys raiding a mansion on the beach, killing and retrieving the body of an old man that they hand off to some guys in a car. There's also this scientific research center out in the ocean that discovers this old relic down underneath, which they believe is connected to the lost city of Atlantis. It's found near the remains of a sunken Russian sub, and they try to bring it up. But then there's this gang of thugs on motorcycles, and their leader is wearing a translucent skull mask. But then there's this massive storm, and a giant bubble-like structure comes out of the water and destroys the facility. Luckily, the surviving scientists are rescued by Mike and Mohammed, and by sheer happenstance, they know each other. Like, what are the odds of that? Trouble kicks in when one of them pulls a gun and says they all have to die, and ends up jumping overboard, but not before they spot that he has a tattoo that looks like one of the symbols on that tablet. They land on a nearby island and start to explore, eventually coming face to face with that gang of biker marauders. The two squads face off, leading to gunfights and decapitations, and they realize that the gang's attack began at the same time that the storm hit. Turns out that the goons are descendants of the Atlanteans and want that relic in order to reclaim the world for their own. And hey, look at that! A movie that isn't post-apocalyptic. But I guess, based on the appearance of the Crystal Skulls gang, you could say that there's a bit of Mad Max influence going on. And this is from Ruggero Deodato, director of the infamous Cannibal Holocaust, and this is the first time he's been on the project since 1980. It seems that when he was filming, they shot in the Philippines, and Ruggero wanted to use the same areas that Coppola used for Apocalypse Now, but was disappointed to find out that those areas had been completely cleared, and was disheartened that the jungle was destroyed for a film. It didn't get much of a release over here, only playing limited runs, but did get some attention on the home market. And I'll give this a 3. It's silly fun, but mostly lightweight. It's that kind of film that's fun while you're watching it, and you're having a good time with it, but you won't think anything about it afterwards. Its significance is just a 1.5, since it's one that didn't really make a splash over here, and only has Deodato's involvement in terms of names. Should you watch it? I think so. It's not much in terms of plot, but it's a good time. This year ends on the small screen as we jump back to the science part of science fiction on December 7th. And let's cap 83 off with Prototype. One of the Van Helsings is here, as is a brutal guy, and he seems a bit off. Dr. Forrester brings him home, and I guess this is before he started wearing bright green lab coats, and he and Michael have a little dinner with his wife. Turns out that Michael is an android designed to be as human as possible, and Carl took him home to see if his wife would be fooled by him, which she is. Kevin's mom also works in the lab, and trouble begins when Carl's boss tells the military about the project and they come in to take Michael away. They test him and bring him back, saying they made modifications, which the crew is very upset about, especially when they find out they had him firing weaponry. The doc decides to take matters into his own hands and steals him out of the lab. They go on the run with the government in pursuit, with Michael taking a particular interest in the story of Frankenstein. And hey, this is my neighborhood. You can't see it from this angle, but the Michael Myers house is right behind here. And this building is the hardware store that Michael had broken into. The two bond, with Michael showing a sensitivity that he didn't expect, and a desire to learn more about the human experience. So, this one was a TV movie that ran on CBS and was directed by David Green. He had been working on various things since the 50s, and even did an episode of the original Twilight Zone, but also did features like the 70s film adaptation of Godspell. One of the funnier things about this one is the later versions of the marketing. Early VHS copies had a more science fiction vein to it, but later editions wanted to take advantage of the Terminator. They gave it this cover art, with a familiar-looking robo-skull and a drill going into it, and a tagline of, "The future is not friendly." Another version did keep a picture of Michael on it, but then also had that skull there with red glowing eyes and the same tag. But nothing like that is represented in this movie. Michael is, in fact, very friendly and not harmful to anyone, really. He's the good guy of the film, with the government after him. And the film has more of a short-circuit, is this guy really alive vibe to it than Terminator. But I guess that doesn't sell videotapes. And I'll give this a 3. I like what it's doing, and I'm interested in some good character stuff, but it's perhaps too dry and doesn't have quite the budget to pull off what it wants to do. Its significance is just a 1.5 since it's not known and doesn't have the reach that other AI-oriented films from this time have, but it does have enough star power for an extra 0.5. Should you watch it? I'd say yeah, it's a nice little sci-fi drama that tells a pleasant, if unremarkable story.
No, don't hold me. Why not? You'll feel the metal.
So there you have it, all of the sci-fi and fantasy superhero genre films of 1983. And yeah, this was a pretty interesting year for the genre, but let's do this. Let's check out our best of superlative list for this year. For best special effects, I'm going to give this one to Return of the Jedi. It's the most polished looking film of the year with the most complex and intricate effects. For best so bad it's good, well, that can only go to your Hunter from the Future. For most WTF, I'm going to go ahead and give that to Lucio Fulci's Conquest, because what the hell's going on in that movie? For the most unique, I'm going to give that to The Little Girl Who Conquered Time. It's just such a bizarre and unusual film, particularly in the way that it's told. As the most overrated, I know this is going to be controversial, but I'm giving it to The Day After, even after I gave it 4 tapes here. And yes, I do love that movie, but I think that showing the implications of a nuclear war, I think that there's other films that did it better, and its significance is maybe a little bit overrated. On that same note, for the most underrated, I'm giving to Testament. I think Testament is the more brutal and raw and true version of what would happen after a nuclear war, and I think it handles the whole thing better. And I feel like a lot of the accolades in terms of the impact that it had is given to The Day After, as opposed to Testament, where I believe it belongs. And finally, as the most amazing sci-fi movie of 1983, personally, for me, I'm giving it to Krull. This movie is just a blast. I love it. I could watch it over and over and over again. I really enjoyed this one. I know it's cheesy, but that's what I love about it. Let me know your picks down below in the comments. I'd like to hear what you think is the best, which one is most overrated, most underrated. Tell me that all down below in the comments. I want to hear it. Also, if you enjoyed this video, if you enjoy the project, if you like what I'm doing here, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you can get notified when new videos are coming out. And also check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/movietimelines. And yes, we'll be coming right at you because very, very soon now we're going to be dipping into the sci-fi films of 1984 very soon, right here on the 80s Project.